The foundations of classical game theory. Ah, yes. We left the first chapter acknowledging the inherent limitations of purely rational models. Now, let's gently delve into the foundational cracks, the places where human behavior deviates from the perfectly calculated actions assumed in classical game theory. We venture into the domain of behavioral game theory, fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality, concepts that add a richer, albeit more complex, texture to our understanding of strategic interaction. Imagine, if you will, a perfectly balanced equation, and now we introduce subtle weights on either side, observing how the equilibrium shifts. Fairness, a concept seemingly simple, yet deeply entwined with our social fabric, presents a significant challenge to the classical model. The classical economist, in his pursuit of optimization, often assumes individuals are solely motivated by self-interest, maximizing their material payoff. However, experiments consistently demonstrate that people are willing to sacrifice personal gain to ensure a more equitable distribution of resources. Think of the Ultimatum Game. One player proposes a division of a sum of money, and the other can either accept it, in which case the money is divided as proposed, or reject it, in which case both players receive nothing. Classical theory predicts that the proposer should offer the smallest possible amount, and the responder should accept it, as any amount is better than nothing. Yet, responders frequently reject offers they perceive as unfair, even if it means receiving nothing at all. This behavior suggests that people value fairness and are willing to punish perceived unfairness, even at a personal cost. This willingness to punish unfairness leads us to the next crucial element, reciprocity. Reciprocity is the principle of responding to another's actions with a similar action. If someone is kind to you, you tend to be kind in return. Conversely, if someone is unkind, you might feel inclined to retaliate. Classical game theory can struggle to incorporate this nuanced aspect of human interaction. Models often focus on one-shot interactions, where there's no history or future consequence of current actions. In reality, many interactions are repeated, and individuals build reputations based on their past behavior. The expectation of future interaction alters the strategic landscape. A reputation for being fair and cooperative can lead to long-term benefits, even if it requires short-term sacrifices. This creates a dynamic where reciprocity becomes a rational strategy in itself, though rooted in emotions and social norms that classical models often overlook. Think of it as a delicate dance, where each step influences the subsequent one, building a pattern of cooperation or conflict. Finally, we come to bounded rationality. This concept acknowledges that human beings are not perfectly rational, calculating machines. Our cognitive abilities are limited. We have finite time, limited information, and imperfect computational power. We employ heuristics, mental shortcuts, that allow us to make decisions quickly and efficiently, even if they don't always lead to the optimal outcome. The classical economist often assumes perfect information and unlimited computational abilities, a stark contrast to the reality of human decision-making. Consider the game of chess. In theory, there exists an optimal strategy for each player, but in practice, the complexity of the game makes it impossible for humans to calculate the optimal move in every situation. Instead, we rely on rules of thumb, patterns recognition, and intuition. These mental shortcuts, while often helpful, can also lead to systematic biases and errors in judgment, deviating from the predictions of classical game theory. The policymaker, armed with the tools of behavioral game theory, can craft more effective interventions. Understanding that individuals are motivated by fairness, reciprocity, and are subject to cognitive biases allows for the design of policies that are more likely to be successful in the real world. For instance, framing effects, how information is presented, can significantly influence choices. A policy framed in terms of potential losses might be perceived differently than the same policy framed in terms of potential gains, even if the objective outcome is identical. So, we've seen how fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality introduce complexities that classical game theory often overlooks. These behavioral factors aren't merely deviations from rationality. They are fundamental aspects of human decision-making, shaping our strategic interactions in profound ways. They represent the hum in the system, the vibrations that keep the dance of economics from becoming perfectly and unrealistically, still. And as we embrace these nuances, we can see a path towards more realistic and relevant economic models. But is this the final evolution of our models? Will we ever reach a point where behavior can be perfectly predicted? Or are we destined to forever chase the elusive shadow of true human motivation? The Ultimatum Game. Challenging rationality. Last time, we touched upon the elegant, if somewhat detached, world of classical game theory, a framework built upon the assumption of perfect rationality. Each player, a calculating machine optimizing for self-interest. But what happens when we introduce a human element, that messy, unpredictable variable known as us? Tonight, we delve into a fascinating experiment, a microcosm of human interaction that throws a wrench into the perfectly oiled gears of classical economics. The Ultimatum Game. It's a simple game with profound implications, revealing the potent forces of fairness, reciprocity, and the limitations of purely rational decision-making. Imagine two participants. One, designated the proposer, receives a sum of money, say $100. Their task? To propose a division of this money with the other participant, the responder. The rules are simple. The proposer offers a portion of the $100 to the responder. The responder then has a choice: accept the offer, in which case both parties receive the agreed-upon amounts, or reject the offer, in which case both parties receive absolutely nothing. A zero-sum ending. Now, let us consider what the classical economist would predict. Assuming both players are perfectly rational and self-interested, the proposer should offer the smallest possible amount, perhaps $1. The responder, faced with the choice between $1 and nothing, should, rationally speaking, accept the offer. After all, $1 is undeniably better than $0. This outcome, a near total appropriation by the proposer, is the Nash equilibrium of this game, the point where neither player can improve their outcome given the other player's strategy. However, this is rarely what happens in reality. In countless experiments conducted across cultures, proposers rarely offer the minimum possible amount. Instead, they tend to offer something closer to a 40-50% split. And responders, strikingly, often reject offers below a certain threshold, even though rejecting means receiving nothing at all. This observed behavior flies in the face of the predictions of classical game theory. What explains this divergence? The answer, it appears, lies in the realm of behavioral economics. The Ultimatum Game exposes the limitations of the perfect rationality assumption, highlighting the importance of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. Fairness, in this context, isn't just a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's a deeply ingrained human instinct. Responders perceive low offers as unfair, a violation of social norms of equitable distribution. This perception triggers a negative emotional response, a sense of injustice, that outweighs the purely rational calculation of maximizing monetary gain. Rejecting the offer, even at a cost to themselves, becomes a way of punishing the proposer for their perceived unfairness. It's an act of enforcing a social norm, a small act of rebellion against inequity. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond to others in kind, also plays a role. Proposers, anticipating the responder's aversion to unfair offers, tend to offer more, driven by a desire to avoid rejection and secure some profit. This is not necessarily altruism. It's a strategic adaptation to the responder's likely behavior. It's a recognition that human behavior is driven by more than just cold, calculated self-interest. And then there's bounded rationality. We are not, in reality, the perfectly rational beings posited by classical economics. Our cognitive abilities are limited. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to make decisions. We are influenced by emotions, social norms, and biases. In the Ultimatum Game, the responder's decision is likely influenced by a heuristic: reject offers that feel unfair. This heuristic, while not perfectly rational in the traditional sense, can be adaptive in the long run, promoting cooperation and discouraging exploitation within a community. The policymaker must, therefore, understand the implications of a populace's bounded rationality. Decisions must be simple, honest, and easily explained. The Ultimatum Game, therefore, serves as a powerful reminder that economics is not just about abstract models and mathematical equations. It's about understanding human behavior in all its complexity and apparent irrationality. It forces us to reconsider the assumptions that underpin our economic theories and to develop models that better reflect the realities of human interaction. The flow of logic, previously so smooth, now encounters eddies and currents, forcing us to rechart our course. By understanding the role of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality, we can develop more effective policies, design better institutions, and create a more equitable and just world. But where does this understanding lead us next? How do these behavioral insights influence our understanding of markets and the formation of preferences in those markets? We shall investigate this next time. Chapter 4. Fairness Preferences. Equity and Inequality Aversion. We've wandered through the landscapes of loss aversion and hyperbolic discounting, observing how human psychology deviates from the pristine rationality imagined by the classical economist. Now, let's turn our gaze towards another fascinating divergence, the human preoccupation with fairness. It's a concept that ripples through our societies, our relationships, and, unsurprisingly, our economic decisions. This chapter will delve into the realm of fairness preferences, specifically exploring equity and inequality aversion. Imagine it as tuning the economic models, allowing them to vibrate with a fuller, more human resonance. The bedrock of traditional economic thought rested on the assumption of self-interest. Individuals were portrayed as rational actors, relentlessly pursuing their own material gains. But life, as we know it, is rarely so simple. Experiments and observations consistently demonstrate that people care about more than just their own payoff. They are often motivated by a desire for fairness, even when it comes at a personal cost. The initial bridge between pure self-interest and observed behavior was a simple realization. Humans don't always maximize individual gain if it comes at the expense of fairness. Let's begin with the concept of equity. Equity, in this context, refers to a sense of proportionality between inputs and outputs. It is the idea that individuals who contribute more to a collective effort should receive a larger share of the rewards. Imagine two workers collaborating on a project. One worker dedicates significantly more time and effort. If the profits are split equally, the more diligent worker might feel a sense of inequity, a sense that the distribution is unfair. This feeling can lead to decreased motivation, resentment, and even attempts to sabotage the process. Economic systems must account for this human tendency to find and maintain an equitable balance. Now, let's consider inequality aversion. This goes beyond simply wanting a fair share based on one's contribution. Inequality aversion describes a distaste for unequal outcomes, even when those outcomes do not directly affect one's own payoff. This is perhaps a more subtle and profound deviation from pure self-interest. Think of a scenario where you are offered a substantial sum of money, but someone else receives an even larger amount. Even though your own wealth has increased, you might still feel a pang of discomfort, a sense that the inequality is somehow unjust. This aversion to inequality can influence behavior in complex ways, driving individuals to reject offers that are perceived as too unequal, even if those offers are objectively beneficial. Consider the classic Ultimatum Game. In this game, one player, the proposer, is given a sum of money and must propose how to divide it with another player, the responder. The responder can either accept the proposal, in which case the money is divided as proposed, or reject the proposal, in which case both players receive nothing. According to traditional economic theory, the responder should accept any offer, no matter how small, because something is always better than nothing. However, experiments consistently show that responders often reject offers that they perceive as unfair, even if it means forgoing a positive payoff. This rejection is a powerful demonstration of inequality aversion in action. The ramifications of fairness preferences extend far beyond the laboratory. They influence wage negotiations, charitable giving, and even political decision-making. The policymaker must understand that pure economic efficiency is not the only driver of human behavior. Policies that are perceived as unfair, even if they are economically sound, are likely to face resistance and ultimately fail. A truly effective economic system must incorporate a sense of fairness, balancing efficiency with equity. These fairness preferences are not always perfectly rational, and their manifestation can be influenced by a variety of factors, including cultural norms, social context, and individual personality traits. The intensity of inequality aversion can vary significantly from person to person and across different societies. The human mind, after all, is not a simple calculator. It is a complex and nuanced system, deeply influenced by emotions and social considerations. As we consider the profound impact of fairness and reciprocity on economic behavior, it's natural to wonder if these behaviors are innate or learned, or some complex mixture of both. What evolutionary pressures might have shaped our innate sense of fairness? Are there neurological structures that underpin these behaviors? And if so, how can we leverage this understanding to design more effective and equitable economic systems? These are the questions that lead us to consider the very nature of human rationality and its boundaries. And that, perhaps, is a journey for our next exploration. Chapter 5. The Dictator Game. Pure Altruism. We've considered how individuals strategize, sometimes rationally, sometimes less so, when anticipating the actions of others. Now, let's shift our focus inward, to a space where strategic calculation seemingly takes a back seat. We will examine the dictator game, a seemingly simple exercise that reveals intriguing complexities regarding fairness, altruism, and the limitations of purely self-interested models. The dictator game, in its purest form, presents a participant, the dictator, with a sum of money. This individual is then instructed to divide this money between themselves and another, anonymous participant, the recipient. The crucial element? The recipient has absolutely no power to influence the dictator's decision. They simply receive whatever is offered, or nothing at all. From the perspective of the classical economist, predicting behavior in this game is remarkably straightforward. Assuming rational self-interest, the dictator should logically keep the entire sum. After all, giving any portion away yields no tangible benefit, and the recipient has no recourse to punish stinginess. The model predicts complete selfishness. Yet, empirical evidence paints a vastly different picture. Numerous studies, conducted across diverse populations and cultures, consistently demonstrate that dictators rarely keep everything. A significant proportion of individuals offer some portion of the money, often ranging from 10% to 50%, to the recipient. This observed behavior presents a significant challenge to the traditional economic assumption of pure self-interest. What drives this deviation from predicted rationality? Several explanations have been proposed. One compelling argument centers on the concept of altruism. Perhaps individuals derive utility not only from their own material gain, but also from the well-being of others. A generous offer, then, could be interpreted as a means of increasing the dictator's own subjective satisfaction, even at a monetary cost. However, defining and measuring altruism proves to be a subtle dance. Is it pure, selfless concern for another's welfare, or is it tinged with considerations of social desirability, a desire to appear generous even in anonymity? The dictator game, while seemingly isolating, may still be influenced by perceived social norms. The dictator may anticipate, consciously or unconsciously, a judgment of their character, even if that judgment remains unspoken. Another perspective highlights the role of fairness norms. Individuals may possess an inherent sense of what constitutes a fair distribution, even in the absence of strategic incentives. They may feel a moral obligation to share, viewing the complete appropriation of the money as unjust. This internal sense of fairness acts as a counterweight to purely selfish impulses. Furthermore, the framing of the game itself can significantly influence outcomes. If the money is described as a windfall, a sudden, unexpected gain, dictators are more likely to share. Conversely, if the money is presented as earned income, obtained through some effort or task, they tend to be more selfish. This framing effect underscores the importance of context and perception in shaping economic behavior. The dictator game also reveals the limitations of assuming unbounded rationality. Individuals may not meticulously weigh the costs and benefits of every possible action. Instead, they may rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts that simplify decision-making. A simple rule, such as share a portion, may be applied without detailed calculation. The policymaker, then, must understand these nuances when designing interventions. Assuming that individuals will always act in their narrowly defined self-interest can lead to ineffective or even counterproductive policies. Recognizing the presence of altruism, fairness norms, and bounded rationality is crucial for crafting policies that resonate with human behavior and promote desirable social outcomes. Ultimately, the dictator game encourages us to reconsider the very nature of economic motivation. It prompts us to ask, to what extent are our decisions driven by pure self-interest, and to what extent are they influenced by a more complex interplay of factors, including altruism, fairness, and the subtle pressures of social norms? As we move forward, we will explore how these considerations of fairness and reciprocity influence interactions in environments where decisions are far from anonymous and the weight of expectation rises. Chapter 6. The Trust Game. Measuring trust and reciprocity. Last time, we explored the inherent imperfections in human decision-making, the fascinating ways in which our minds, noble as they are, deviate from the purely rational ideal. Now, let's venture into a specific arena where these imperfections bloom, the realm of trust and reciprocity, measured through the deceptively simple, yet profoundly insightful, trust game. Imagine, if you will, two players, comfortably seated, though their comfort is undoubtedly about to be tested. One, player A, is given a sum of money. Let's say 10 crisp, imaginary dollars. They are then presented with a choice. How much of this money, if any, will they entrust to player B? Whatever amount is sent to player B is then tripled. Thus, if player A sends $5, player B receives $15. Herein lies the crux. Player B now faces their own decision. They can keep the entire tripled sum, enriching themselves handsomely, or they can return a portion of it to player A. The game concludes. Fortunes are tallied, and the players part ways, perhaps wiser, perhaps more cynical. Wise. What does classical economic theory, personified by our imagined classical economist, predict? Well, in their view, player B, motivated purely by self-interest, will keep everything. Knowing this, player A, anticipating player B's avarice, will send nothing in the first place. A perfectly rational, perfectly distrustful, and perfectly suboptimal outcome. The dollars remain unused, potential wealth unrealized. A chillingly logical, and yet profoundly unrealistic conclusion. In reality, and across countless replications of this game, player A does send money. Often, a substantial portion. This act defies the cold calculus of pure self-interest. It is an act of trust, a belief that player B will, to some extent, reciprocate. Why? Because human beings, bless them, are not solely driven by profit maximization. We are also moved by considerations of fairness, by a desire to maintain social equilibrium, by an inherent sense of right and wrong. But the story doesn't end there. The amount player B returns is equally telling. Do they return enough to make player A whole? Do they split the tripled sum evenly? Or do they, as the classical economists predicted, keep it all? Here, we observe a spectrum of behaviors, a fascinating interplay of self-interest and altruism. Some, driven by a strong sense of reciprocity, return more than enough to compensate player A. Others return just enough to appear fair. And yes, some, disappointingly, confirm the classical economist's bleak outlook. The trust game, therefore, acts as a powerful magnifying glass, revealing the subtle, often unconscious, forces that shape our economic interactions. It demonstrates that trust is not simply a naive sentiment, but a strategic asset. In societies where trust is high, economic transactions flourish, cooperation thrives, and collective well-being improve. Where trust is low, stagnation and suspicion reign. These observations have profound implications for the policymaker. Understanding the dynamics of trust and reciprocity allows them to design institutions and policies that foster cooperation and mitigate the risks of opportunism. Strong legal frameworks, transparent governance, and social norms that promote fairness all contribute to a high-trust environment, encouraging investment, innovation, and economic growth. Moreover, the trust game illuminates the concept of bounded rationality. We are not perfectly rational beings, capable of calculating every possible outcome. Instead, we rely on heuristics, on rules of thumb, on our emotional responses to guide our decisions. While these shortcuts can sometimes lead to suboptimal results, they also allow us to navigate the complexities of social interaction, to build relationships, and to create a world richer than pure cold self-interest could ever achieve. The trust game, seemingly simple, reveals deep truths about human nature and its impact on the economy. It whispers a reminder that economics is not just about numbers and equations, but about people, their beliefs, and their willingness to trust one another. It shows us that fairness and reciprocity are not mere sentimentalities, but essential ingredients for a thriving and equitable society. As we ponder on these findings, one question lingers like a gentle breeze. If trust and reciprocity are so vital, how do we effectively cultivate them in an increasingly complex and interconnected world? This is a question we will begin to explore in our next session. Chapter 7. Defining Reciprocity. Positive and Negative. Yes. We left off last time discussing the inherent limitations of purely self-interested models in predicting economic behavior. The Homo economicus, that rational, utility-maximizing automaton, often fails to capture the nuances of human interaction. And this failure is nowhere more apparent than when we examine the concept of reciprocity. Tonight, we shall gently unpack the complexities of reciprocity, dividing it into its two primary forms, positive and negative. Think of it as a delicate balancing act, a seesaw governed not solely by rational self-interest, but also by perceived fairness and emotional response. Let's begin with positive reciprocity. This is perhaps the more palatable and comforting of the two. Positive reciprocity, at its core, describes the tendency to respond to kind actions with kindness. It's the warm feeling of gratitude that compels us to return a favor, to offer help to someone who has helped us. It manifests as a desire to treat others as they have treated us, fostering a cycle of cooperation and mutual benefit. Imagine, for a moment, a local bakery. The baker consistently offers generous samples, remembers your name, and provides service with a smile. Over time, you develop a sense of obligation, a quiet urge to support this establishment. You might recommend it to friends, perhaps even go out of your way to purchase a loaf of bread, even if a cheaper option exists elsewhere. This, my friends, is positive reciprocity in action. It's a gentle current flowing through the marketplace, strengthening social bonds and promoting economic exchange based on more than just price. Positive reciprocity is not always about immediate direct exchange. It can also be about upholding social norms of fairness and contributing to a collective good. Consider the act of tipping a waiter. The classical economist might argue that a rational diner would only tip if they expected to receive future service from that same waiter. However, we often tip even in restaurants we are unlikely to revisit. This suggests a broader understanding of social obligation, a desire to reward good service and contribute to the well-being of those who serve us. Now, let us shift our attention to the darker side of the coin, negative reciprocity. This is the tendency to respond to perceived unfairness or harm with actions intended to punish or retaliate. It's the burning desire for revenge, the quiet satisfaction of seeing someone who has wronged you receive their due. And, unsettlingly, it can lead to surprisingly costly behaviors. Consider the Ultimatum Game, a staple of behavioral economics. In this game, one player, the proposer, is given a sum of money and must propose how to divide it with another player, the responder. The responder can either accept the offer, in which case the money is divided as proposed, or reject the offer, in which case both players receive nothing. The classical economist predicts that the responder will accept any offer, no matter how small, as receiving something is better than receiving nothing. Yet, in reality, responders frequently reject offers they perceive as unfair, even if it means forgoing a substantial sum of money. This is negative reciprocity at play. a willingness to punish the proposer for their perceived greed, even at personal cost. Negative reciprocity is not always a purely emotional response. It can also be a strategic tool for enforcing social norms and deterring future transgressions. Think of boycotts, strikes, or even acts of informal social shaming. These actions, while often costly to those who participate, can serve to punish those who violate norms of fairness and encourage more cooperative behavior in the future. It's important to note that the line between positive and negative reciprocity can be blurred. What one person perceives as fair, another may perceive as unfair. Cultural norms, individual experiences, and even subtle contextual cues can all influence our perceptions of fairness and our subsequent reciprocal responses. Furthermore, the strength of reciprocal motivations can vary greatly from person to person. Some individuals are inherently more forgiving and cooperative, while others are more prone to anger and retaliation. This heterogeneity is one of the great challenges and great interests of behavioral game theory. And so, we arrive at the edge of another exploration. Having defined these two core aspects of reciprocal behavior, one can now begin to ask, what are the deeper roots of these impulses? What mechanisms, both psychological and neurological, underpin our seemingly innate desires to reciprocate, both positively and negatively? These are the questions that guide our next foray into the fascinating world of behavioral economics. Sleep well, and let us ponder them in the morning. Intentions matter. The role of beliefs we've navigated through the initial tides of behavioral game theory, witnessing the erosion of assumptions surrounding perfect rationality. Our last exploration centered on how individuals react to perceived unfairness. Now, let us gently shift our focus, turning our attention to the often underestimated power of beliefs, specifically, how perceived intentions color our economic decisions. Consider this a subtle adjustment to the lens through which we view economic interactions. The classical economist, in their idealized world, assumes individuals are driven solely by self-interest, responding mechanically to incentives. Offer a greater reward, and a predictable surge in effort should follow. Threaten a harsher penalty, and compliance becomes virtually assured. But the human psyche, as we've been slowly discovering, is far more nuanced than a simple stimulus-response mechanism. We are not merely maximizing machines, blindly calculating costs and benefits. We are meaning-making creatures, constantly interpreting the world around us and, crucially, the motivations of others. Imagine a scenario. A manager decides to implement a pay cut across the board due to unforeseen economic hardship. The classical economist would expect employees to react solely based on the size of the cut. A 10% reduction should elicit a predictable level of discontent. However, behavioral game theory suggests something more complex is at play. If employees believe the manager is acting in bad faith, perhaps prioritizing shareholder profits over employee well-being, the negative reaction will be amplified. The perceived unfairness of the intention behind the pay cut will outweigh the purely monetary loss. Conversely, if employees believe the manager is genuinely trying to navigate a difficult situation and is sharing the burden fairly, they may be more understanding, even accepting. The same pay cut, filtered through different lenses of perceived intention, evokes radically different responses. This highlights the crucial role of reciprocity. We are not simply calculating machines. We are also wired to respond to kindness with kindness and to animosity with animosity. This reciprocity isn't always about equal exchange. It's about responding to perceived goodwill. If we believe someone is acting fairly and with good intentions, we are more likely to cooperate, even if it comes at a slight personal cost. This is where the concept of gift exchange enters. Instead of solely offering financial incentives, the policymaker might consider signaling trustworthiness and goodwill. This could involve increased transparency in decision-making, fostering a culture of open communication, or demonstrating a genuine commitment to employee well-being. These seemingly intangible factors can have a profound impact on productivity and morale, often exceeding the effects of purely monetary incentive. Think of it as a system of weights and balances. Rational self-interest remains a powerful force, but it is counterbalanced by considerations of fairness, reciprocity, and perceived intentions. When these forces are aligned, the system flows smoothly, leading to cooperation and mutual benefit. When they are misaligned, conflict and inefficiency ensue. This is where bounded rationality truly manifests. Our limited cognitive resources and biases can distort our perceptions of intentions, leading to suboptimal decisions. We might misinterpret someone's actions as malicious when they are simply clumsy, or we might overestimate the benevolence of someone who is cleverly manipulating us. The implication for policy design is significant. The policymaker cannot simply rely on crafting incentives based on the assumption of purely rational self-interest. They must also consider how their policies will be perceived, what signals they will send, and whether they will foster a sense of fairness and trust. A policy that appears objectively efficient may be rejected if it is perceived as unfair or manipulative. A policy that is slightly less efficient may be embraced if it is perceived as fair and well-intentioned. This necessitates a deeper understanding of human psychology and the subtle ways in which beliefs shape our behavior. So, as we gently allow these thoughts to settle, let us ponder a lingering question. How can institutions be designed to better signal trustworthiness and good intentions, fostering a more cooperative and efficient economic environment? This is the next current of thought we will explore. Good night. Chapter 9. Bounded Rationality. Cognitive limitations. Last time, we explored the fascinating influence of fairness and reciprocity on strategic decisions, a significant departure from the self-interest paradigm of classical economics. Now, let us delve into another key pillar of behavioral game theory, bounded rationality. This concept, like a slow, steady stream eroding the rock face of traditional economic assumptions, acknowledges the cognitive limitations that inevitably shape our choices. Imagine the human mind, not as a perfectly optimized calculating machine, but as a powerful, yet finite, processing unit. Classical economic models often assume that individuals are perfectly rational actors. They possess complete information, unlimited cognitive abilities, and can effortlessly calculate the optimal strategy in any given situation. They are, in essence, economic demigods. However, reality, as it so often does, presents a more nuanced and humbling picture. We, as humans, are subject to cognitive biases, time constraints, and limited attention spans. We are not perfectly rational. We are, at best, reasonably rational. This reasonableness, this accommodation to the real world, is the essence of bounded rationality. Bounded rationality acknowledges that decision-makers strive for optimal outcomes, but they do so within the constraints of their cognitive abilities and the information available to them. Think of it as a search problem. We are looking for the best possible solution, but our search is not exhaustive. We use heuristics, mental shortcuts, and rules of thumb to simplify complex problems and arrive at satisfactory, if not perfectly optimal, solutions. These heuristics, while often effective, can also lead to systematic biases and deviations from the predictions of rational choice models. One common manifestation of bounded rationality is the use of satisficing. Instead of exhaustively searching for the absolute best option, individuals often settle for the first option that meets a certain acceptable threshold. Consider a consumer searching for a new car. They may have a list of desired features and a budget in mind. Rather than visiting every dealership and comparing every model, they may stop their search once they find a car that meets their essential criteria at a reasonable price. This is satisficing in action, accepting a good enough solution rather than striving for perfection. Another crucial aspect of bounded rationality is the impact of framing. The way in which information is presented can significantly influence decisions, even if the underlying economic realities are identical. For example, a medical treatment described as having a 90% survival rate is often perceived more favorably than the same treatment described as having a 10% mortality rate. The information is equivalent, but the framing evokes different emotional responses and cognitive biases. The implications of bounded rationality extend far beyond individual decision-making. They have profound consequences for understanding market dynamics, organizational behavior, and policy design. The policymaker, for instance, needs to be acutely aware of these cognitive limitations when designing regulations or public health campaigns. Assuming that individuals will always respond rationally to incentives can lead to unintended and often undesirable outcomes. For example, consider a campaign designed to encourage energy conservation. Simply providing information about energy consumption and potential cost savings may not be enough to motivate behavioral change. The policymaker might need to frame the message in a more compelling way, perhaps by highlighting the social benefits of energy conservation or by providing personalized feedback that makes the issue more tangible and relatable. Bounded rationality also impacts how firms operate. Organizations are not single, monolithic entities driven by pure profit maximization. They are composed of individuals with diverse cognitive abilities, biases, and motivations. The challenge for managers is to design organizational structures and processes that can effectively harness the collective intelligence of their employees while mitigating the risks associated with cognitive limitations. Ultimately, understanding bounded rationality is about recognizing the inherent complexities of human behavior and incorporating these complexities into our economic models. It is a move away from the idealized world of perfect rationality towards a more realistic and nuanced understanding of how decisions are actually made. This perspective, like the slow accumulation of sediment in a riverbed, enriches and deepens our understanding of economic phenomena. As we move forward, we must consider how these cognitive limitations interact with other psychological factors, such as emotions and social norms. How do our feelings and our social context further shape our decisions within the boundaries of our rationality? This question, like a distant shore on a calm sea, beckons us towards the next stage of our exploration. Good night. Chapter 10. Heuristics and Biases in Decision-Making. As we've seen, rational choice theory, while elegant, sometimes struggles to fully capture the complexities of human behavior. It paints a picture of individuals as perfectly informed, consistently self-interested, and effortlessly calculating optimal outcomes. But what happens when these assumptions are challenged? We now turn our attention to the fascinating realm of behavioral game theory, which introduces elements of fairness, reciprocity, and the very human limitations of bounded rationality into our understanding of strategic interactions. Imagine it as introducing a gentle current into a still pond, subtly altering the flow of decisions. The classical economist envisions individuals maximizing their own utility in a game-theoretic setting, meticulously weighing costs and benefits. Behavioral game theory, however, acknowledges that people often deviate from this ideal, influenced by factors that traditional models tend to overlook. These deviations frequently arise from our reliance on heuristics, mental shortcuts that simplify decision-making in a complex world. Heuristics are invaluable tools, allowing us to navigate daily life efficiently, but they can also lead to predictable biases. Consider the availability heuristic. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, perhaps because they are recent or particularly vivid. The policymaker crafting regulations might overreact to a dramatic, but rare, incident, neglecting more common though less sensational risks. This bias stems not from malice or incompetence, but from the inherent limitations of our cognitive processing, our minds favoring easily retrievable information, much like a river following the path of least resistance. Another pervasive bias is the representativeness heuristic. This involves judging the probability of an event based on how similar it is to a stereotype or prototype. Imagine being presented with a description of someone, quiet, meticulous, and detail-oriented. Many might assume they are a librarian, overlooking the fact that there are far more farmers than librarians. This is because the description resembles our stereotype of a librarian. The representativeness heuristic often misleads us because we neglect baseline probabilities. Furthermore, our decisions are profoundly influenced by framing effects. The way a choice is presented can significantly alter our preferences, even if the underlying options are objectively identical. A medical procedure with a 90% survival rate sounds far more appealing than one with a 10% mortality rate, even though they convey the same information. The framing effect creates an illusion, bending our perception of gain and loss. Beyond heuristics, behavioral game theory highlights the importance of fairness and reciprocity. The classical economist assumes individuals are solely motivated by self-interest, But experimental evidence consistently shows that people are often willing to sacrifice personal gain to uphold notions of fairness or to reciprocate kindness or punish perceived injustice. Think of the Ultimatum Game. One player proposes how to split a sum of money, and the other player can either accept or reject the offer. If the offer is rejected, both players receive nothing. According to standard economic theory, the proposer should offer the smallest possible amount, and the responder should accept anything greater than zero. However, people frequently reject offers they perceive as unfair, even if it means receiving nothing. This demonstrates that fairness considerations can outweigh pure self-interest, acting like a counterweight to the drive for pure profit. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond in kind to the actions of others, also plays a crucial role. People are more likely to cooperate with those who have cooperated with them in the past, and are willing to punish those who have defected. This behavior promotes trust and cooperation in social and economic interactions. If someone extends a hand to help you, you might extend one back to them in turn. These reciprocal actions build networks of trust and allow for further cooperation. Finally, bounded rationality acknowledges the limitations of our cognitive capacity, time, and information. We cannot always process all available information and make perfectly rational decisions. Instead, we often satisfice, choosing an option that is good enough rather than striving for the absolute optimum. In a world of infinite choices and limited resources, satisficing is a practical survival strategy. It is as if our mental capacity is a vessel, and we choose a volume that won't spill. Behavioral game theory, therefore, offers a richer and more nuanced understanding of human decision-making. It incorporates psychological insights into economic models, providing a more realistic framework for analyzing strategic interactions. By recognizing the influence of heuristics, biases, fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexities of economic behavior. This shift in perspective has profound implications for policy design, negotiation strategies, and our understanding of markets themselves. How can policymakers design regulations that mitigate the effects of cognitive biases? This is just one of the many questions that guide us towards the next phase of our exploration. Chapter 12. The Centipede Game. Backwards Induction. Paradoxes. Tonight, we delve into a fascinating, if somewhat perplexing, corner of behavioral game theory. Imagine a game, not of fierce competition, but of delicate trust and deferred gratification. This is the essence of the Centipede Game. Picture two players seated across from each other. Before them lies a sum of money, let's say $2. At each turn, a player can either cooperate and pass the money to the other, slightly increasing the total pot, or defect and take the larger share for themselves, ending the game. The crucial twist. With each pass, the total amount available grows. Perhaps it starts at $2, then $3, then $4, and so on, with each player receiving a slightly larger share if they cooperate. But each defection awards the defector a larger advantage. The classical economist, armed with the tools of rational choice theory, would analyze this game using backwards induction. Starting from the very last decision point, the player faced with the final choice would rationally choose to defect. Why? Because defecting guarantees them a larger payout than cooperating. Knowing this, the player before them, anticipating that defection, would also rationally choose to defect at their turn, preempting the loss of potential gains. This logic cascades backward, leading to the conclusion that the first player, at the very beginning of the game, should defect immediately, taking the initial, smaller share. This theoretical outcome, however, rarely aligns with observed behavior. In real-world experiments, people tend to cooperate, passing the money multiple times, forgoing immediate gains in the hope of a larger shared reward later. The length of the game, the number of turns before it inevitably ends, significantly influences this behavior. The longer the game, the more likely players are to cooperate, defying the prediction of backwards induction. So, where does the disconnect lie? It hinges on several factors that behavioral game theory illuminates: fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. Fairness plays a role. Individuals may be willing to sacrifice some immediate personal gain to achieve a more equitable outcome. The initial defection, while rationally sound in maximizing individual profit, can be perceived as unfair, violating an implicit social contract of cooperation. Reciprocity is another key element. Players often condition their behavior on the actions of their opponent. A perceived willingness to cooperate can trigger a reciprocal response, leading to a virtuous cycle of mutual benefit. However, the fear of being exploited, of being the sucker, can also drive individuals toward early defection. And then there's the matter of bounded rationality. The classical economist assumes perfect rationality, the ability to flawlessly calculate the optimal strategy. But human cognition is limited. Processing the complex implications of backwards induction, especially in a multi-stage game, can be cognitively demanding. Instead, players may rely on simpler heuristics, rules of thumb, such as cooperate until the other person defects. This simplification, while not perfectly rational, can lead to outcomes that are collectively more beneficial. These deviations from strict rationality highlight the limitations of traditional economic models in capturing the nuances of human behavior. The centipede game serves as a stark reminder that fairness, reciprocity, and cognitive constraints can profoundly influence decision-making, leading to outcomes that defy the predictions of purely rational analysis. The policymaker, therefore, must consider these psychological factors when designing interventions, crafting incentives that align with human tendencies towards cooperation and reciprocity, rather than relying solely on the assumption of unwavering self-interest. The enduring puzzle of the centipede game lies in the tension between individual rationality and collective well-being. The pursuit of individual advantage can lead to a suboptimal outcome for everyone involved. Understanding the psychological forces that drive cooperation, even in the face of apparent rational incentives to defect, is crucial for designing institutions and policies that foster trust and mutual benefit. As we consider these concepts, a question lingers in the air. How much do other cognitive biases affect strategic decision-making in other complex environments? Chapter 13. The Public Goods Game, Cooperation and Free Riding. Welcome, once again, to our late-night exploration of the human economy. We've navigated the somewhat turbulent waters of risk aversion and cognitive biases. Now, let us gently steer toward a more communal concept, one deeply embedded in the fabric of our societies: the provision of public goods. The public goods game, a cornerstone of behavioral game theory, offers a simplified yet profound lens through which to examine cooperation and free riding. Imagine a group of individuals, each endowed with a certain sum of money. They face a choice: contribute to a common pot, a public good, or keep the money for themselves. The contributions to the pot are then multiplied by a factor and distributed equally among all participants, regardless of their individual contributions. Now, consider the perspective of the classical economist. Rooted in the assumption of pure self-interest and perfect rationality, they would predict a bleak outcome: complete free riding. Why? Because each individual, meticulously calculating the costs and benefits, would realize that their personal contribution yields a return that is less than the original investment. The marginal benefit of contributing accrues to the group, while the full cost is borne individually. Thus, the dominant strategy, in the cold light of rational self-interest, is to contribute nothing at all. Everyone, according to this model, would succumb to the tragedy of the commons, leading to a suboptimal outcome where the public good is severely underfunded, if at all. However, real-world experiments paint a strikingly different picture. Initial contributions are often surprisingly high, frequently hovering around 40% to 60% of the endowment. This observed behavior defies the prediction of pure self-interest. What explains this initial impulse towards cooperation? The answer lies in the interwoven concepts of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality that underpin behavioral game theory. Fairness suggests a sense of moral obligation, a belief that contributing to the public good is the right thing to do. Participants might derive a sense of satisfaction or well-being from contributing, offsetting the purely financial cost. Reciprocity, on the other hand, speaks to the expectation that others will also contribute. It's a conditional cooperation, a willingness to cooperate contingent upon the perceived cooperation of others. But here is where the balance can shift, where the harmonious chords of cooperation begin to fray. Over repeated rounds of the public goods game, contributions often decline. This decline is largely attributed to the observation of free riding. When individuals perceive that others are not contributing their fair share, they retaliate by reducing their own contributions. This creates a downward spiral, a negative feedback loop where perceived unfairness breeds further non-cooperation. The initial spark of altruism is slowly extinguished by the cold wind of perceived injustice. This decay in cooperation highlights the crucial role of enforcement and institutions. The policymaker, observing this dynamic, might consider mechanisms to incentivize cooperation and punish free riding. These mechanisms could range from simple peer-to-peer punishment systems to more formal, centralized systems of reward and sanction. Experiments have shown that even the possibility of punishment, even at a cost to the punisher, can dramatically increase contribution levels and sustain cooperation over time. The key is to establish a credible threat of negative consequences for those who exploit the system. Bounded rationality also plays a role. Individuals may not possess the cognitive capacity or the time to perfectly calculate the optimal strategy. They might rely on heuristics, rules of thumb, or social norms, rather than engaging in complex mathematical calculations. These simplified decision-making processes can lead to both cooperation and free riding, depending on the specific heuristic being employed. A simple rule like match the average contribution can sustain cooperation, while a rule like contribute as little as possible can lead to the tragedy of the commons. Ultimately, the public goods game offers a valuable microcosm for understanding the challenges of collective action. It demonstrates that while pure self-interest may predict complete free riding, human behavior is far more nuanced, driven by a complex interplay of fairness, reciprocity, bounded rationality, and institutional incentives. It forces us to consider how to design institutions and policies that foster cooperation and mitigate the temptation to free ride, ensuring the sustainable provision of essential public goods. As we prepare to move on, consider this. If fairness and reciprocity are so powerful, why do cooperation failures still occur? What deeper psychological or environmental factors might be at play, tipping the scales toward non-cooperation? This question will linger as we drift toward our next exploration, the realm of bargaining and negotiation. Chapter 14: Social Dilemmas. Tragedy of the commons. We've navigated the currents of individual biases, the subtle eddies that pull us away from perfectly rational choices. Now, let us widen our scope. Let us consider the confluence of individual imperfections, the places where those rivulets meet and form a larger, sometimes turbulent, stream. Today, we explore social dilemmas, specifically the tragedy of the commons, viewed through the lens of behavioral game theory. The tragedy of the commons at its heart is a story of misalignment. It speaks of situations where individual rationality, meticulously pursued by each agent, leads to a collectively suboptimal outcome. Imagine a shared pasture, open to all herders. Each herder, acting in their own best interest, seeks to maximize their gain by adding more and more cattle. Individually, this makes sense. More cattle, more profit. However, the pasture has a finite capacity. Overgrazing inevitably results. The pasture becomes barren, and all herders suffer. This, my friends, is the tragedy. The classical economist, with their unwavering belief in rational actors, might prescribe a simple solution: private ownership. Divide the pasture into individual plots, and each herder will internalize the costs of their actions. If they overgraze their own plot, they alone bear the consequences. A beautifully elegant solution, in theory. But the world is rarely so neatly divisible. What about shared resources like clean air, fisheries, or even internet bandwidth? These are commons of a different kind, and the allocation of private rights becomes significantly more complex, sometimes impossible. Behavioral game theory offers a richer, more nuanced understanding of these dilemmas. It acknowledges that human behavior is not solely driven by cold, calculated self-interest. Fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality play significant roles. Let's consider fairness. In many experimental games, individuals consistently deviate from the purely self-interested strategy. They are willing to sacrifice personal gain to ensure a more equitable distribution of resources. This sense of fairness, however, can be easily manipulated. Perceptions of unfairness, whether real or perceived, can trigger retaliatory behavior, exacerbating the tragedy of the commons. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond in kind to the actions of others, also exerts a powerful influence. If one herder begins to restrain their grazing, others may follow suit, fostering a sense of cooperation. Conversely, if one herder blatantly disregards the common good, others may be tempted to do the same, triggering a downward spiral. The tragedy, therefore, is not inevitable. It is contingent upon the prevailing norms of reciprocity within the group. Trust, a delicate and precious commodity, becomes paramount. Bounded rationality, the recognition that our cognitive abilities are limited, further complicates the picture. We are not perfect calculators, capable of instantaneously processing all available information. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and rules of thumb. These shortcuts can be helpful in navigating complex situations, but they can also lead to systematic errors. For instance, we might underestimate the long-term consequences of our actions, focusing instead on immediate gratification. Or, we might overestimate the probability that others will cooperate, leading to disappointment and defection. The policymaker, armed with insights from behavioral game theory, can design interventions that promote cooperation and avert the tragedy of the commons. Simple measures, such as clearly defining property rights, establishing monitoring systems, and imposing penalties for non-compliance, can be effective. But more subtle interventions aimed at shaping perceptions and fostering a sense of shared responsibility can also be crucial. Framing the issue in terms of collective loss rather than individual gain can be surprisingly persuasive. Appealing to moral values and social norms can reinforce cooperative behavior. Consider, for example, a campaign to encourage water conservation during a drought. Simply highlighting the potential for water shortages may not be enough. But framing the issue in terms of our collective responsibility to future generations, or emphasizing the importance of water conservation for maintaining community harmony, can be far more effective. The key is to tap into our innate sense of fairness and reciprocity, and to acknowledge the limitations of our own rationality. Ultimately, the tragedy of the commons is a reminder that individual and collective interests are not always aligned. It is a call for us to be mindful of the impact of our actions on others, and to strive for a more cooperative and sustainable world. It requires a balance, a delicate dance between individual autonomy and collective responsibility. This balance is never perfectly achieved, but the pursuit of it is what defines a civilized society. As we consider these dynamics of social consequence, it begs the question: what are the societal mechanisms for effectively correcting group irrationality, and how do we optimize them? It is to these corrective mechanisms that we will turn our attention next. Until then, sleep well. Chapter 15. Cooperation in Repeated Games. Tit for tat, we've explored scenarios of one-time interaction, the static dance of strategic choices. But human existence, and therefore the economy, is rarely a fleeting moment. It's a continuous unfolding, a tapestry woven with repeated interactions. This brings us to the fascinating realm of cooperation in repeated games, where the shadow of the future dramatically alters the present. The question we now address is this: how can cooperation emerge and be sustained when rational self-interest might seemingly dictate defection at every turn? The answer, or at least a significant part of it, lies in strategies that foster reciprocity and build trust over time. One of the most elegant and widely studied of these is the tit-for-tat strategy. Imagine two players, locked in a repeated prisoner's dilemma. In each round, they can choose to cooperate or defect. Tit-for-tat dictates a simple, yet powerful, rule. On the first round, cooperate. Thereafter, simply mirror the opponent's previous move. If they cooperated in the last round, you cooperate in this round. If they defected, you defect. It is a strategy of conditional cooperation, blending forgiveness with a firm stance against exploitation. Consider its mechanics. The initial act of cooperation sends a clear signal of goodwill. It extends an olive branch, inviting mutual benefit. If the opponent reciprocates with cooperation, the cycle continues, a self-reinforcing loop of mutual advantage. This fosters a cooperative equilibrium, a stable state where both players benefit more than they would through persistent defection. But what happens when defection enters the picture? Tit for tat responds immediately, mirroring the defection in the subsequent round. This punishment is sufficient to deter further exploitation. The defector experiences the immediate cost of their action, diminishing the appeal of future defection. Crucially, however, the punishment is not permanent. After a single round of mirroring, tit for tat reverts to cooperation, offering the opponent a chance to redeem themselves. This forgiveness prevents endless cycles of retaliation, allowing cooperation to re-emerge if the opponent chooses to cooperate. This strategy embodies several key principles recognized by behavioral economics. First, it incorporates reciprocity. Humans are inherently inclined to return favors and punish transgressions. Tit for tat leverages this ingrained tendency, aligning strategic behavior with natural inclinations. The classical economist, focused solely on maximizing immediate payoff, might dismiss such considerations. But tit for tat acknowledges that preferences extend beyond purely monetary gains, encompassing fairness and a desire for equitable interactions. Second, tit for tat builds trust. The consistent and predictable nature of the strategy allows players to anticipate each other's actions. This predictability, in turn, fosters trust, reducing the uncertainty that often leads to defection. When players believe that cooperation will be reciprocated, they are more willing to take the initial risk of cooperation. Third, the success of tit for tat hinges on the discount factor, the weight players place on future payoffs relative to present ones. If the future is sufficiently important, if players are patient enough, the long-term benefits of sustained cooperation outweigh the short-term gains of defection. A high discount factor, a strong valuation of the future, is a crucial ingredient for the success of this strategy. However, tit for tat is not without its vulnerabilities. One potential problem is misinterpretation. If one player accidentally defects, the cycle of retaliation can be initiated, even though neither player intended to break the cooperative equilibrium. This highlights the importance of clear communication and the potential for costly misunderstandings. Moreover, tit for tat is not the only successful strategy in repeated games. More sophisticated strategies exist, capable of achieving even higher levels of cooperation in certain environments. Nonetheless, tit for tat serves as a powerful illustration of how cooperation can emerge and be sustained through simple, yet effective, strategies that incorporate reciprocity, build trust, and value the future. It reminds the policymaker that incentives are not solely about immediate rewards and punishments, but also about shaping expectations and fostering a culture of cooperation. It is a delicate dance, this balance between self-interest and mutual benefit. As we consider the elegance and simplicity of tit for tat, we are left to ponder: how do these principles of cooperation translate into the broader context of economic systems? What are the implications for market design, regulatory frameworks, and the very fabric of economic interaction? Evolutionary game theory. Survival of the fittest strategies. Tonight, we turn our gaze to a fascinating extension of game theory, one that whispers not of static equilibria, but of dynamic evolution. Remember our discussions on behavioral game theory. The quirks of human nature, fairness, reciprocity, and our inherent limitations in rational calculation often led us away from the purely self-interested outcomes predicted by classical models. Now, imagine these behavioral nuances subjected to the relentless pressures of selection, not unlike the natural world. This, in essence, is evolutionary game theory. Evolutionary game theory casts a wide net, borrowing heavily from biology. Instead of rational actors consciously strategizing, we consider populations of agents playing games repeatedly over time. The success of a particular strategy or a particular behavioral phenotype is measured by its payoff relative to the other strategies present in the population. Strategies that yield higher payoffs become more prevalent. Think of it as a kind of social learning or imitation, where successful behaviors are copied and spread. Less successful strategies, naturally, dwindle in proportion. A central concept here is the evolutionarily stable strategy, or S. An S is a strategy that, once adopted by a sufficiently large proportion of the population, cannot be invaded by any mutant strategy. It's a form of dynamic equilibrium, a stable point in the evolutionary landscape. The key is that stability arises not from individual foresight, but from the aggregate consequences of repeated interactions. Consider, for example, a simple game like the hawk-dove game. Imagine a population of birds competing for a limited resource. Hawks are aggressive and always fight for the resource, while doves are passive and only display. If the cost of fighting is high enough, a population of pure hawks would be unstable, as the frequent injuries would keep their average payoff low. Similarly, a population of pure doves would be vulnerable to invasion by a single hawk, who would easily seize the resources. The S in the hawk-dove game is a mixed strategy, a proportion of hawks and a proportion of doves existing in stable equilibrium. The precise mix depends on the costs and benefits of fighting. This simple example highlights how evolutionary game theory can generate complex and nuanced outcomes, even with very basic behavioral assumptions. Now, let's bring back our familiar friends from behavioral economics: fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. How do these influence the evolutionary landscape? Imagine introducing a tit-for-tat strategy into the prisoner's dilemma within an evolutionary framework. This strategy starts by cooperating and then mimics the opponent's previous move. Unlike a purely self-interested strategy of always defecting, tit-for-tat fosters cooperation over time. Under certain conditions, particularly with repeated interactions, tit-for-tat can become an S, leading to a cooperative equilibrium even in the absence of explicit agreements or enforceable contract. The implications for economics are profound. The classical economist, with his assumptions of perfect rationality, often struggles to explain the prevalence of cooperation in real-world settings. Evolutionary game theory, on the other hand, provides a plausible mechanism for the emergence of cooperation from the bottom up, driven by the survival of strategies that promote mutual benefit. Furthermore, considering bounded rationality, the limits of our cognitive abilities, adds another layer of realism. Individuals may not be able to perfectly calculate the optimal strategy in a complex environment. Instead, they might rely on simple heuristics, rules of thumb that have proven successful in the past. Evolutionary processes can then select for these more efficient heuristics, leading to adaptive behavior, even without complete information or unlimited processing power. The policymaker, armed with the insights of evolutionary game theory, might design institutions and policies that nudge behavior towards more desirable outcomes. For example, structuring incentives to reward cooperation and punish defection can shift the evolutionary landscape, making cooperative strategies more likely to thrive. Understanding the dynamics of social learning and imitation can also inform the design of effective public awareness campaigns. Evolutionary game theory offers a powerful lens through which to view economic phenomena. It reminds us that individuals are not isolated decision-makers, but rather are embedded in complex social systems, where their actions are constantly shaping and being shaped by the behavior of others. It moves us from static analysis to a dynamic understanding of how strategies evolve and adapt over time. As we contemplate this intricate dance between behavior and selection, we might wonder, how does the speed of environmental change affect the ability of strategies to adapt and survive? Does a rapidly changing world favor flexibility and innovation over established routines? Cultural differences in fairness norms. Welcome back. We've spent some time exploring how notions of fairness and reciprocity can drastically alter the predictions of standard economic model. We've observed, essentially, that humans are not purely self-interested utility maximizers, but rather possess a complex calculus of social preferences. Now, let's gently pivot and consider a question that adds yet another layer of complexity to this already nuanced landscape. How do these fairness norms vary across different cultures? The core tenets of behavioral game theory, particularly those relating to fairness, are often presented as universal. But is this truly the case? The assumption, often implicit, is that humans everywhere respond to perceived unfairness in similar ways, and that reciprocity is a global phenomenon. However, anthropological and sociological research offers a powerful counterpoint, suggesting that notions of what constitutes fair and the appropriate response to perceived unfairness are, to a considerable extent, culturally constructed. Consider the Ultimatum Game, a classic tool for probing fairness preferences. In this game, one player proposes a split of a sum of money, and the other player can either accept or reject the proposal. If the proposal is rejected, both players receive nothing. The classical economist would predict that any offer greater than zero should be accepted, as something is always better than nothing. However, experimental evidence consistently shows that low offers, often perceived as unfair, are frequently rejected, even when the amount offered is substantial. Now, imagine replicating this experiment across diverse cultural settings. What we find is far from uniform. In some societies, particularly those with strong communal values and a history of cooperative resource management, offers tend to be more generous, and rejection rates for unfair offers are higher. The emphasis is on maintaining social harmony and ensuring equitable distribution. Deviation from this norm elicits a stronger negative response. In other societies, perhaps those with a more individualistic ethos or a history of hierarchical social structures, we might observe lower offers and acceptance rates that are higher, even for offers considered unfair by Western standards. The tolerance for inequality might be greater, or perhaps the potential loss of any gain is deemed unacceptable, regardless of the perceived fairness of the offer. The decision-making calculus is influenced by a different set of cultural priorities. The implications for the policymaker are profound. Interventions designed to promote economic development or social welfare must be carefully tailored to the specific cultural context. A policy that succeeds in one society may fail spectacularly in another, if it disregards deeply ingrained notions of fairness and reciprocity. The notion of what is fair is not a mathematical constant. It is a variable molded by cultural narratives, historical experiences, and social institutions. Furthermore, the expression of fairness, the way in which individuals respond to perceived injustice, can also differ significantly. Some cultures may favor direct confrontation and open protest, while others may prioritize indirect methods of redress, such as social ostracism or subtle forms of resistance. Understanding these cultural nuances is crucial for effective communication and conflict resolution in international contexts. The interplay between fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality is a delicate dance, one where the steps are learned through cultural transmission. We cannot assume that the rules of this dance are universal. To do so would be to commit a grave error, one that could lead to misunderstandings, misinterpretations, and ultimately, ineffective policy. The question remains: how can we refine our models of behavioral economics to better account for the pervasive influence of culture on human decision-making? How do we build a more robust framework that recognizes the diversity of fairness norms across the globe? Chapter 18. Gender Differences in Gameplay. Good evening. We've spent considerable time navigating the waters of rational choice, examining the idealized landscape where actors weigh costs and benefits with an almost preternatural accuracy. But real life, as we know, rarely conforms to such pristine models. Tonight, we turn our attention to a specific area where the cracks in this ideal become particularly visible. Gender differences in gameplay, viewed through the lens of behavioral game theory. Think of this as a gentle descent into the complexities of human behavior, illuminated by the soft glow of empirical observation. Behavioral game theory, at its heart, acknowledges the limitations of purely rational models. It incorporates psychological insights into our understanding of strategic interactions, recognizing that fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality all exert a powerful influence. These forces, like subtle currents in a vast ocean, can dramatically alter the course of individual decisions and collective outcomes. Let's consider fairness. The classical economist often assumes that individuals are solely motivated by maximizing their own material payoffs. However, numerous experiments, such as the Ultimatum Game, reveal a different story. In this game, One player proposes a division of a sum of money, and the other player either accepts or rejects the offer. If the offer is rejected, both players receive nothing. A perfectly rational player should accept any offer, no matter how small, as receiving something is always better than receiving nothing. Yet, time and again, offers perceived as unfair, say, a proposal where one player receives only a tiny fraction of the total, are rejected, often out of a sense of indignation or a desire to punish the perceived injustice. This suggests that individuals value fairness, sometimes even more than monetary gain. And here is where gendered differences begin to emerge. Research consistently demonstrates that women on average tend to exhibit a greater aversion to unfairness than men. In ultimatum game experiments, women are more likely to reject low offers, even when the absolute amount they would receive is substantial. This heightened sensitivity to fairness can have significant implications in various economic contexts, from wage negotiations to charitable giving. Now, let's turn our attention to reciprocity. Reciprocity describes the tendency to respond to others' actions with similar behavior, whether positive or negative. A kind act is often met with kindness, while an act of betrayal can trigger retaliation. This tit-for-tat strategy, as it's sometimes called, is crucial for maintaining social order and fostering cooperation. Think of it as the invisible glue that binds communities together. When it comes to reciprocity, the evidence suggests a more nuanced picture of gender differences. While both men and women engage in reciprocal behavior, the context and intensity can vary. For example, studies have shown that women may be more likely to engage in positive reciprocity, rewarding cooperative behavior with greater generosity. This could stem from societal expectations or inherent differences in social preferences. Conversely, men may be more prone to negative reciprocity, retaliating more fiercely against perceived transgressions. These are, of course, broad generalizations, and individual differences are substantial, but the trend is notable. Finally, we arrive at bounded rationality. This concept acknowledges that our cognitive abilities are limited. We cannot process all available information perfectly, nor can we anticipate all possible outcomes. Instead, we rely on heuristics or mental shortcuts to simplify decision-making. These shortcuts can be incredibly useful, but they can also lead to systematic biases and errors. The policymaker concerned with equitable outcomes should be keenly aware of how bounded rationality intersects with gender. For example, studies have suggested that women may exhibit different risk preferences than men, particularly in financial contexts. This might stem from differences in financial literacy, access to information, or even confidence in their own decision-making abilities. Consequently, women may be more likely to opt for safer, albeit lower-yielding, investment strategies, which can have long-term implications for their financial security. Understanding these gendered differences in fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality is not about reinforcing stereotypes. Rather, it is about acknowledging the complexities of human behavior and designing policies and institutions that are more responsive to the needs and preferences of diverse populations. By recognizing the subtle currents that shape our decisions, we can create a more equitable and efficient economic system. This brings us to the question of how these observed differences evolve over time, and what role cultural factors play in shaping them. A question that will guide our exploration of the next economic phase. Good night. Chapter 19. The Brain and Behavioral Game Theory. Neuroscience Insights. We've explored the foundations of behavioral game theory, observing how individuals consistently deviate from the predictions of classical economic models. Now, let us gently steer our thoughts toward the biological substrate underpinning these behaviors, the brain itself. We will delve into how neuroscience sheds light on fairness, reciprocity, and the bounded rationality that shape our strategic interactions. Think of this as tracing the streams of economic behavior back to their source springs within the human mind. The classical economist often presumes a world of perfect rationality, where individuals meticulously calculate expected utilities and optimize their choices. However, behavioral game theory reveals a different story, a narrative of fairness considerations, reciprocal tendencies, and cognitive limitations that profoundly influence decision-making. But where do these deviations originate? Neuroscience offers crucial clues, painting a vibrant picture of the brain as a dynamic, interconnected system where emotions, social cognitions, and cognitive control mechanisms interplay to shape our strategic behavior. Consider fairness, for instance. Classic game theory often predicts outcomes that, while maximizing individual gain, appear deeply unfair to most people. The Ultimatum Game, where one player proposes a division of a sum of money and the other can either accept or reject it, is a prime example. The classical economist might predict the proposer offering the smallest possible amount and the responder accepting it, as something is better than nothing. Yet, in reality, people frequently reject offers deemed unfair, even at a personal cost. Neuroscience reveals that such rejections are often accompanied by heightened activity in brain regions associated with negative emotions, such as the anterior insula. This area is known to be involved in processing disgust and pain, suggesting that unfairness is experienced as aversive. Conversely, fair offers may activate reward-related brain areas, contributing to a sense of satisfaction and promoting cooperation. This interplay of emotional and cognitive processes provides a deeper understanding of why fairness considerations are so powerful in shaping our choices, often overriding purely rational calculations. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond to kindness with kindness and to unkindness with unkindness, is another fundamental aspect of human behavior that challenges the assumptions of traditional game theory. The classical economist might struggle to explain why individuals engage in costly punishment of those who violate social norms, even when there is no direct personal benefit. Neuroimaging studies suggest that rewarding cooperative behavior and punishing defection both activate reward circuits in the brain. The act of punishing a defector, even at a cost to oneself, can trigger a sense of satisfaction and justice. This implies that reciprocal behaviors are not merely the result of calculated self-interest, but are also driven by deeply ingrained social preferences and a desire to maintain social order. The brain, in essence, seems wired to value cooperation and to enforce norms of reciprocity. Bounded rationality, the idea that our cognitive abilities are limited, and that we often rely on heuristics and biases when making decisions, further complicates the picture. The policymaker must grapple with this reality when designing effective interventions. What? Neuroscience helps us understand the neural mechanisms underlying these limitations. For example, our capacity for working memory, the ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it, is finite. This constraint can limit our ability to fully analyze complex strategic situations and to consider all possible outcomes. Furthermore, our brains are prone to cognitive biases, systematic errors in thinking that can distort our perceptions and judgments. These biases, often rooted in emotional responses and unconscious associations, can lead us to make suboptimal decisions in strategic settings. Neuroimaging studies have begun to identify the neural correlates of these biases, providing insights into how they arise and how they might be mitigated. In essence, neuroscience offers a powerful lens through which to examine the neural underpinnings of behavioral game theory. By understanding how the brain processes fairness, reciprocity, and how its limitations shape our choices, we can develop more accurate models of human behavior in strategic interactions. This, in turn, can lead to more effective policies and interventions that nudge individuals towards more desirable outcomes. But are these neuroscientific insights the final word? Or do cultural and environmental factors further modulate these neural circuits, creating a richer tapestry of human economic behavior? This delicate dance between nature and nurture remains a question for future exploration. fMRI studies, mapping neural activity, welcome, once again. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the living brain, a landscape of neural activity illuminated by the magic of fMRI. We are interested in understanding how the tenets of behavioral game theory, fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality, manifest within the intricate architecture of our minds. fMRI, as you know, allows us to non-invasively monitor blood flow in the brain, which serves as an indirect measure of neuronal activity. Regions that become more active require more oxygen, leading to increased blood flow, which is detected by the scanner. The classical economist, a creature of pure rationality, assumes that individuals are self-interested maximizers. However, experimental evidence, as we've discussed, consistently demonstrates that people deviate from this model. Individuals frequently exhibit a concern for fairness, a willingness to reciprocate kindness, and cognitive limitations that prevent them from making perfectly rational decisions. The question is, can we see these deviations happening live in the brain? Let us begin with fairness. Consider the ultimatum game, a deceptively simple paradigm. One player, the proposer, receives a sum of money and proposes how to divide it with another player, the responder. The responder can either accept the offer, in which case both players receive the agreed-upon amounts, or reject it, in which case both players receive nothing. The classical economist would predict that the proposer will offer the smallest possible amount, and the responder will accept it, as even a small amount is better than nothing. Yet, responders frequently reject offers they perceive as unfair, even when this means forgoing a financial gain. What is happening in the brain when an unfair offer is presented? fMRI studies reveal that unfair offers often activate areas associated with negative emotions, such as the anterior insula. This region is known to be involved in processing feelings of disgust, pain, and social exclusion. Simultaneously, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a region associated with cognitive control and self-regulation, is also activated. This suggests a conflict: the emotional impulse to reject the unfair offer versus the cognitive calculation of potential gain. The relative strength of these activations may predict whether the responder ultimately accepts or rejects the offer. An interesting point is that damage to DLPFCC has been found to reduce the rate of rejected offers, as if the impulse control is lessened. Now, let us turn to reciprocity. The trust game, also known as the investment game, offers insights into reciprocal behavior. In this game, one player, the investor, can choose to send a portion of their endowment to another player, the trustee. The amount sent is then multiplied by a factor. The trustee then decides how much of the multiplied amount to return to the investor. The classical economist might predict that the trustee will return nothing, as they are better off keeping the entire multiplied amount. However, studies show that trustees often return a significant portion, especially when the investor initially sent a large sum. This behavior can be construed as reciprocity, a response in kind to the investor's initial act of trust. When individuals engage in reciprocal behavior, we observe increased activity in brain regions associated with reward and social cognition. For example, the ventral striatum, a key component of the brain's reward circuitry, is often activated when individuals receive a returned investment. Furthermore, regions implicated in mentalizing and understanding others' intentions, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction, are also engaged. This suggests that reciprocal behavior is not simply a matter of blind altruism, but rather involves an assessment of the trustee's intentions and a desire to maintain a positive social relationship. Finally, consider bounded rationality. Our cognitive capacities are, of course, limited. We cannot process all available information instantaneously, nor can we foresee all possible consequences of our actions. This limitation leads to the use of heuristics, mental shortcuts that simplify decision-making. Neuroimaging studies are beginning to explore the neural correlates of these heuristics. For instance, research suggests that the prefrontal cortex plays a crucial role in implementing and adapting these cognitive shortcuts. However, the precise neural mechanisms underlying different types of heuristics are still an area of active investigation. The policymaker, ever seeking to influence behavior, finds great interest in these findings. If we can understand the neural mechanisms underlying fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality, perhaps we can design interventions that promote more prosocial and efficient outcomes. Imagine designing incentives that specifically target reward centers when acts of fairness are performed, or educational programs that improve cognitive skills for better decision-making. However, let us proceed with caution. The brain is a complex and dynamic system. While fMRI provides valuable insights, it is essential to remember that correlation does not equal causation. Brain activity is merely a correlate of mental processes, not the processes themselves. Furthermore, interpreting fMRI data requires careful consideration of experimental design, statistical analysis, and potential confounds. It is merely one facet in the grand prism of understanding human behavior. Chapter 21. Hormones and Gameplay. Oxytocin and Testosterone. Good evening. Tonight, we delve into the fascinating intersection of biology and behavioral economics. We often frame economic interactions, be they negotiations, market exchanges, or social dilemmas, as purely rational exercises. We build models predicated on the idea of Homo economicus, the rational economic actor tirelessly maximizing their self-interest. But what if the very architecture of our biological selves predisposes us to deviate from this ideal? Two hormones in particular warrant our attention: oxytocin and testosterone. These aren't just players in the drama of reproduction. They are potent modulators of social behavior, profoundly impacting fairness, reciprocity, and, yes, our bounded rationality. Let's begin with oxytocin. Often lauded as the love hormone or the trust hormone, oxytocin is a neuropeptide associated with bonding, empathy, and social connection. Studies suggest that oxytocin can increase trust and cooperation in economic games. Imagine a classic trust game. One player receives an endowment and can choose to send some, all, or none of it to a second player. Any amount sent is then tripled by the experimenter. The second player then decides how much of this tripled sum to return to the first player. In this scenario, the classical economist would predict that the first player should send nothing. However, humans routinely send a substantial portion of their endowment. Moreover, when the first player receives a whiff of oxytocin, this generosity is often amplified. It's as if the hormone subtly lubricates the pathways of social connection, prompting us to act in ways that prioritize cooperation over pure self-interest. This doesn't necessarily imply that oxytocin abolishes self-interest entirely. Rather, it recalibrates the calculus, shifting the balance point. It might lead us to perceive the other player not as a mere counterparty in a transaction, but as a fellow member of a social group deserving of consideration and perhaps even altruism. Oxytocin seems to broaden the scope of our perceived self-interest to encompass the well-being of others, thereby facilitating cooperation even when immediate payoffs are uncertain. Now, let's turn our gaze to testosterone. While often associated with aggression and dominance, its role in economic decision-making is more nuanced than popular stereotypes suggest. In the context of bargaining games, for instance, higher testosterone levels can be associated with both increased competitiveness and a heightened sensitivity to fairness. A player with elevated testosterone might be more assertive in demanding a larger share of the pie, but they might also be more likely to reject an offer they perceive as unfairly low, even if it means receiving nothing at all. Consider the Ultimatum Game. One player proposes how to divide a sum of money, and the other player either accepts the proposal or rejects it. The classical economist predicts that the second player should accept any offer, no matter how small, as something is better than nothing. Yet, in reality, people often reject offers they deem unfair, effectively punishing the first player for attempting to exploit them. Studies suggest that testosterone can amplify this rejection behavior. It's as if the hormone sharpens our sense of justice, making us more willing to incur a personal cost to punish perceived unfairness. This can be interpreted as a form of altruistic punishment, where individuals sacrifice their own resources to enforce social norms of fairness and reciprocity. The policymaker might even consider this in the framing of law and order. It's crucial to acknowledge that the relationship between hormones and economic behavior is not a simple, linear one. These hormones interact in complex ways, influenced by a multitude of factors including individual differences, social context, and cultural norms. Our understanding of this interplay is still in its nascent stages. Moreover, while oxytocin and testosterone can influence our behavior, they do not completely determine it. We are not mere puppets of our hormones. We possess the capacity for conscious deliberation, reflection, and self-control. Our bounded rationality, while influenced by these biological factors, is not entirely dictated by them. We retain the agency to make choices, even if those choices are subtly nudged by our hormonal landscape. As we begin to close, consider: how might a deeper understanding of these biological influences on economic decision-making inform the design of institutions and policies? Can we leverage our knowledge of these hormonal systems to foster greater cooperation, fairness, and social welfare? And what other biological mechanisms might further illuminate the complexities of human economic behavior, waiting to be discovered in the uncharted territories of the brain? Chapter 22. Behavioral Game Theory and Experimental Economics. Last time, we explored the elegant world of classical game theory, a landscape built on assumptions of perfect rationality. Now, imagine that landscape gently shifting, eroding a little at the edges as we introduce the human element, a touch of real-world complexity. This brings us to behavioral game theory, a field that tempers the theoretical purity with observations from experimental economics, and grapples with concepts like fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. Consider the ultimatum game. The classical economist predicts a rather ruthless outcome. One player, the proposer, is given a sum of money and tasked with splitting it with another player, the responder. The responder can either accept the proposed split, in which case both players receive their allocated amounts, or reject it, leaving both with nothing. Pure rationality dictates that the responder should accept any offer, no matter how small, as something is always better than nothing. Knowing this, the proposer should offer the smallest possible amount. Yet, experiments consistently reveal a different story. Responders frequently reject offers they perceive as unfair, even if it means sacrificing their own potential gain. Proposers, anticipating this, tend to offer a significantly larger share than pure self-interest would dictate. This rejection of a rational outcome points to something deeper at play, a sense of fairness. It suggests that individuals are not solely motivated by maximizing their own monetary payoff, but are also influenced by considerations of equity and justice. Think of it as a counterbalance to pure self-interest, a gentle nudge towards equilibrium in a social context. Reciprocity, another key element of behavioral game theory, further refines our understanding of human behavior. Reciprocity embodies the idea that individuals respond to actions with actions of their own, often in kind. Positive reciprocity involves rewarding kindness and cooperation, while negative reciprocity involves punishing unfairness or exploitation. This is not merely a matter of calculating strategic advantage. It's often driven by emotional responses and a desire to maintain social norms. We see this echoed in various experiments, where participants are more likely to cooperate with those who have cooperated with them in the past, and to retaliate against those who have defected. It's a system of social credit, where reputation and trust play a significant role. Underlying both fairness and reciprocity is the concept of bounded rationality. The classical economist assumes that individuals possess unlimited cognitive resources and can perfectly analyze all possible outcomes. In reality, our cognitive abilities are limited. We are prone to biases, heuristics, and emotional influences. We satisfy rather than optimize, settling for good enough solutions rather than striving for the absolute best. We operate within constraints, often relying on simplified models and mental shortcuts to navigate the complexities of decision-making. This doesn't imply that we are irrational, only that our rationality is bounded by the limitations of our minds. It's like trying to navigate a vast ocean with a rudimentary map. You can still find your way, but your path might be less than optimal. Behavioral game theory doesn't discard the insights of classical game theory, but rather builds upon them, incorporating the complexities of human psychology. It acknowledges that individuals are not merely calculating machines, but social beings, influenced by emotions, norms, and cognitive limitations. This understanding has profound implications for the policymaker, who must design policies that account for these behavioral nuances. A policy designed on the assumption of perfect rationality may fail miserably if it ignores the powerful influence of fairness, reciprocity, and the inherent limitations of human cognition. By exploring these deviations from pure rationality, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of economic behavior. It invites us to consider how our social fabric is woven, not just from self-interest, but also from threads of cooperation, fairness, and a desire to connect with others. The question that lingers then is how might these insights into behavioral economics further reshape our understanding of macroeconomic phenomena, moving beyond individual decision-making to the aggregate level. That, perhaps, is a journey for another time. Chapter 23. Field Experiments. Testing theories in the real world. Last time, we delved into the intricacies of experimental economics within the controlled environment of the laboratory. Now, let us venture beyond those carefully calibrated walls and explore the vibrant, unpredictable landscape of field experiments. Here, we confront the messiness of reality, where economic theories are tested not with student volunteers, but with real people in real markets, making real decisions with real consequences. Our particular focus tonight will be on behavioral game theory and how field experiments illuminate fairness, reciprocity, and the ever-present limitations of human rationality. The shift from the lab to the field represents a crucial evolution in our understanding of human economic behavior. While laboratory experiments offer unparalleled control, they can sometimes feel artificial, divorced from the complex web of social norms and contextual factors that shape our choices in the everyday world. Field experiments, in contrast, embrace this complexity. They allow us to observe how people behave when they are unaware they are being studied, or at least when their behavior is influenced by factors that closely mimic real-world conditions. Behavioral game theory, as you'll recall, challenges the assumptions of classical game theory. The classical economist often posits that individuals are purely self-interested, rational actors, diligently maximizing their own utility. However, behavioral game theory suggests a more nuanced picture, one where fairness, reciprocity, and cognitive limitations play a significant role in shaping strategic interactions. Field experiments provide invaluable evidence for this perspective. Consider, for instance, the Ultimatum Game, which we previously examined in a laboratory setting. In the field, variations of this game have been conducted with shopkeepers in developing countries, with participants bargaining over the price of goods. What these field studies often reveal is that the propensity to reject unfair offers, a behavior seemingly irrational from the perspective of the classical economist, persists in the real world. People are willing to forego monetary gains to punish what they perceive as inequitable treatment. This observed behavior suggests that concerns for fairness and social norms are not mere artifacts of the lab, but powerful motivators in actual economic transactions. Reciprocity, another key tenet of behavioral game theory, also finds strong support in field experiments. Imagine a restaurant where patrons are given mints along with their bill. Studies have shown that even a small gesture of generosity, like offering a mint, can lead to a noticeable increase in tips, demonstrating the power of positive reciprocity. This seemingly minor detail flies in the face of pure self-interest, as the restaurant's action suggests a willingness to share even before expecting compensation. Similarly, studies on charitable giving often find that matching donations, a form of reciprocity on the part of the charity, can significantly boost contributions. Furthermore, field experiments shed light on the phenomenon of bounded rationality. We, as human beings, are not perfect calculators, effortlessly processing all available information and arriving at optimal decision. We are cognitive misers, often relying on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and biases to navigate the complexities of daily life. Field experiments in areas like savings behavior have shown that simple interventions, such as automatically enrolling employees in retirement savings plans, can have a dramatic impact on participation rates. These interventions are effective precisely because they exploit our tendency to stick with the default option, rather than actively making a conscious choice. The policymaker can use these findings to craft policies that gently nudge individuals towards better outcomes, acknowledging the inherent limitations of human rationality. Therefore, the true value of field experiments lies in their ability to bridge the gap between theoretical models and real-world behavior. They provide a powerful toolkit for testing the robustness of economic theories, uncovering behavioral patterns that might be missed in more controlled settings, and informing policy decisions that are grounded in empirical evidence. As we consider these real-world applications, we must remember that the field is not without its challenges. Maintaining experimental control in a complex environment can be difficult. Ethical considerations are paramount, especially when dealing with vulnerable populations, and the very act of observation can at times influence the behavior being studied. Nevertheless, the insights gained from field experiments are invaluable for understanding the intricacies of human economic behavior. As we begin to understand economic systems and their effects on human behavior, one question lingers. How will the ever-growing influence of technology, especially artificial intelligence, affect these existing behavioral patterns and the way we model them in the future? Designing institutions. Nudging and choice architecture. Last time, we explored the fascinating interplay between incentives and information, how seemingly small informational tweaks can dramatically alter behavior. But the human mind is far more complex than a simple input-output device. We are not purely rational actors, calculating expected utility with perfect precision. Today, we delve into the art of designing institutions that acknowledge these inherent human limitations, specifically through the lens of behavioral game theory and its considerations of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. We will explore how policymakers can use nudges and choice architecture to guide individuals towards better decisions, not by coercion, but by thoughtful design. The classical economist often models individuals as perfectly rational, self-interested beings. They make decisions based solely on maximizing their own material well-being. However, behavioral game theory reveals a different picture. Experiments consistently show that people care about fairness. They are often willing to forego personal gain to punish unfair behavior, a phenomenon known as altruistic punishment. Consider the Ultimatum Game. One player proposes a division of a sum of money, and the other player can either accept the proposal, in which case both players receive the agreed-upon amounts, or reject the proposal, in which case both players receive nothing. A perfectly rational proposer should offer the smallest possible amount, and a perfectly rational responder should accept anything above zero. Yet, in reality, offers below a certain threshold are frequently rejected, even though the responder loses money by doing so. This demonstrates a powerful aversion to perceived unfairness. Reciprocity, another key element of behavioral game theory, describes our tendency to respond in kind to the actions of others. Positive reciprocity means we are more likely to cooperate with someone who has cooperated with us in the past. Negative reciprocity means we are more likely to retaliate against someone who has harmed us, even at a personal cost. This inherent inclination towards reciprocal behavior has profound implications for institutional design. For example, institutions that foster trust and cooperation are more likely to be successful than those that assume purely self-interested behavior. Think of micro-lending institutions where high repayment rates are often attributed to social capital and reciprocal obligation within the community. Bounded rationality, the third pillar of our discussion, acknowledges that human cognitive abilities are limited. We have imperfect information, limited time, and finite processing capacity. We use mental shortcuts, or heuristics, to simplify complex decisions. While these heuristics are often useful, they can also lead to systematic biases. The policymaker must consider these biases when designing institutions. For instance, people often exhibit present bias, meaning they place a disproportionate weight on immediate rewards and costs relative to future ones. This can lead to procrastination, undersaving, and unhealthy lifestyle choices. Nudging is a technique that leverages these insights from behavioral game theory to guide individuals towards better decisions without restricting their freedom of choice. A nudge alters the choice architecture, the way choices are presented, to make certain options more appealing or easier to select. For example, automatically enrolling employees in a retirement savings plan, but allowing them to opt out, significantly increases participation rates compared to requiring employees to actively enroll. This is because the default option serves as a nudge, overcoming inertia and present bias. Similarly, presenting food choices in a cafeteria in a way that highlights healthy options can encourage healthier eating habits. The key is that individuals retain the freedom to choose. Nudges simply make it easier to choose the option that is in their best long-term interest. Choice architecture, therefore, is the deliberate design of the environment in which people make decisions. A well-designed choice architecture takes into account the cognitive limitations and behavioral biases of individuals, aiming to promote better choices without resorting to coercion or heavy-handed regulation. It's a delicate balancing act, requiring careful consideration of ethical implications and potential unintended consequences. So, as we design these nudges, these subtle architectures of choice, we must constantly ask ourselves, where does helpful guidance end and manipulative control begin? And as we move towards a world increasingly shaped by algorithmic decision-making, how do we ensure that these algorithms themselves embody fairness, reciprocity, and a genuine understanding of human limitations? These questions, I suspect, will become even more pressing as we explore the future of economic systems. Perhaps we can ponder that in our next session. Behavioral insights in marketing and advertising. We've previously explored how cognitive biases subtly steer consumer choices. Now we delve deeper, venturing into the realm of behavioral game theory, a domain where fairness, reciprocity, and the inherent limitations of human rationality profoundly reshape the landscape of marketing and advertising. Traditional game theory, a cornerstone of classical economics, often paints a picture of perfectly rational actors, each striving to maximize their own utility in a predictable, self-interested manner. The classical economist, in their perfectly modeled world, sees consumers as calculating machines, meticulously weighing costs and benefits before making any decision. But the real world, as we know, is far more nuanced. Behavioral game theory acknowledges that our decisions are not solely driven by cold, hard logic. It recognizes that we are influenced by social norms, emotions, and a deep-seated desire for fairness. These factors, often absent in traditional economic models, can dramatically alter how we respond to marketing messages and advertising campaigns. Consider, for example, the concept of fairness. Imagine two identical products being offered at different prices. One is simply priced higher. The other has its price increased due to a sudden, unforeseen supply chain disruption. While both scenarios ultimately result in a higher price for the consumer, the perceived fairness differs significantly. The classical economist might argue that the end result is all that matters, but behavioral game theory suggests otherwise. Consumers are more likely to accept the price increase justified by the disruption, perceiving it as a circumstance beyond the seller's control. They may react negatively to the unjustified price hike, feeling exploited and potentially boycotting the brand. Marketing campaigns that emphasize transparency and ethical sourcing tap into this inherent desire for fairness, highlighting the fair wages paid to workers or the commitment to environmentally sustainable practices can resonate deeply with consumers, fostering trust and loyalty. Conversely, perceived exploitation or unethical behavior can trigger swift and severe backlash. Closely linked to fairness is the principle of reciprocity. We are by nature wired to reciprocate kindness and generosity. A company that goes above and beyond to provide exceptional customer service or offers unexpected perks and benefits is more likely to cultivate a loyal customer base. This isn't merely about maximizing immediate profits. It's about building long-term relationships based on mutual respect and appreciation. Think of the small, unexpected free gift included with an online purchase, or the personalized thank you note that arrives after a service appointment. These small acts of generosity can have a disproportionately large impact on customer satisfaction and brand advocacy. The marketing industry leverages reciprocity in various forms, from offering free trials to providing valuable content in exchange for email addresses. The key is to offer something of genuine value, without any hidden strings attached. Consumers are quick to detect manipulation and are more likely to respond positively to genuine gestures of generosity. Finally, behavioral game theory acknowledges the bounded rationality of human decision-making. We are not the perfectly rational automatons envisioned by classical economics. We have limited cognitive resources, are prone to biases, and often rely on heuristics, or mental shortcuts, to make decisions quickly and efficiently. This means that even the most meticulously crafted marketing message can be misinterpreted or ignored if it fails to account for these cognitive limitations. The policymaker aiming to nudge behavior needs to understand these cognitive boundaries. Overwhelming consumers with information, using complex jargon, or creating unnecessarily complicated choices can lead to decision fatigue and ultimately inaction. Simplicity, clarity, and relevance are paramount. Effective marketing campaigns often leverage these insights by framing choices in a way that is easily understood and appeals to our emotions, highlighting the potential losses associated with inaction, rather than the potential gains from action, can be a powerful motivator. Creating a sense of urgency or scarcity can also overcome inertia and encourage immediate action. In conclusion, behavioral game theory offers a powerful lens through which to understand consumer behavior in the context of marketing and advertising. By acknowledging the importance of fairness, reciprocity, and the limitations of human rationality, marketers can craft more effective and ethical campaigns that resonate deeply with their target audience. But as we incorporate increasingly sophisticated behavioral models, we must ask, are we simply becoming more adept at subtle manipulation, or are we genuinely enhancing consumer well-being? This delicate balance, the ethical tightrope walk between influence and empowerment, will undoubtedly shape the future of marketing and advertising, a question that perhaps leads us to our next exploration of economic nudges and long-term consumer welfare. Chapter 26. Behavioral Finance. Irrationality in Financial Markets. Having explored the elegant, if sometimes idealized, landscape of efficient markets, we now turn our gaze towards a terrain where emotions, biases, and cognitive limitations subtly, and sometimes dramatically, alter the financial landscape. This is the domain of behavioral finance, and our focus tonight is on the role of fairness, reciprocity, and the rather humbling concept of bounded rationality through the lens of behavioral game theory. Imagine, if you will, the classical economist, a creature of pure reason, perfectly informed, and relentlessly self-interested. In their world, game theory predicts outcomes based on logical deduction. But what happens when we replace this idealized actor with ourselves? Suddenly, the neatly predicted equilibria begin to fray. Consider the ultimatum game. One player is given a sum of money, let's say $100, and is tasked with proposing a split to the second player. The second player can either accept the offer, in which case the money is divided as proposed, or reject it, in which case both players receive nothing. The classical economist would suggest that any offer above zero should be accepted. After all, something is better than nothing. Yet, countless experiments have shown that people consistently reject offers they perceive as unfair, even if it means forgoing a guaranteed sum. This reveals a profound human inclination towards fairness. We are not simply maximizers of personal gain. We are also concerned with equity, with justice. This sense of fairness acts as a powerful constraint on our behavior, diverting us from the path of pure self-interest. It's as though our utility function includes not just our own payoff, but also a weighting of how equitable the outcome is for all involved. This weighting, of course, varies from individual to individual and across cultures, adding a layer of complexity that traditional economic models often overlook. Closely related to fairness is the concept of reciprocity. If someone treats us well, we are inclined to treat them well in return. Conversely, if someone treats us poorly, we are likely to retaliate, even at a cost to ourselves. This can be seen in experimental games like The Prisoner's Dilemma, where cooperation, despite the inherent risk, is often observed. The classical economist would always defect, maximizing their individual payoff regardless of the other player's choice. But humans are often driven by a desire to reciprocate kindness or punish betrayal, leading to outcomes that deviate significantly from the predicted Nash equilibrium. This dance of fairness and reciprocity highlights a crucial point. We are not isolated decision-making units. We are social creatures, deeply embedded in networks of relationships and expectations. Our actions are shaped not only by our own self-interest, but also by our perceptions of how others will react and how our actions will affect them. Then there's bounded rationality. The classical economist possesses an infinite capacity for computation, effortlessly processing vast amounts of information and arriving at optimal decisions. We, on the other hand, are limited. Our cognitive resources are finite. Our attention is easily distracted, and we rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to navigate the complexities of the world. These heuristics, while often useful, can also lead to systematic biases and errors in judgment. For example, the availability heuristic leads us to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, perhaps because they are recent or particularly vivid. The representativeness heuristic causes us to judge the probability of an event based on how similar it is to a stereotype. And anchoring bias leads us to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if it is irrelevant. These cognitive limitations have profound implications for financial markets. They can explain phenomena such as bubbles and crashes, where investor sentiment, rather than rational analysis, drives asset prices. They can also explain why investors often hold on to losing investments for too long, hoping to recoup their losses, or why they sell winning investments too soon, fearing a reversal. Understanding these behavioral biases is crucial for the policymaker. By recognizing the inherent irrationality in financial markets, they can design policies that mitigate the risks posed by bubbles, crashes, and other forms of market instability. They can also educate investors about the dangers of behavioral biases, empowering them to make more informed decisions. The inclusion of these psychological realities into economic models transforms our understanding of market behavior. Debt. It moves us away from the clean, abstract world of the classical economist and towards a richer, more nuanced appreciation of the forces that shape our financial destiny. And as we acknowledge the power of our irrational tendencies, one wonders, what other hidden currents lie beneath the surface of economic activity, waiting to be discovered? What unseen forces shape the grand, complex dance of commerce and value? We shall ponder this in our next session as we delve further into the complexities of economic inequality. Chapter 27: Loss Aversion and Investment Decisions. Good evening. We've traced the arc of rational expectations, observed its elegant dance with markets, and even noted its optimistic assumptions. Now, let us gently drift from the theoretical shores of perfect rationality and into the perhaps murkier, yet infinitely more human, waters of behavioral economics. Specifically, we shall consider loss aversion and its sway over our investment decisions, a prime example of how behavioral game theory, fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality manifests in the financial world. Imagine, if you will, a perfectly balanced scale. On one side, we place the potential gain from an investment, a calculated return, a promising prospect. On the other, we place the potential loss. The classical economist would tell us that a rational actor weighs these equally, making a decision based purely on the expected value. If the potential gain outweighs the potential loss, the investment is deemed worthwhile. However, the human experience is rarely so symmetrical. Behavioral economics, building upon decades of psychological research, reveals a pervasive asymmetry. The pain of a loss is felt more acutely than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. This phenomenon is known as loss aversion, and its influence on investment decisions is profound. The sting of seeing your portfolio diminish in value lingers longer and cuts deeper than the joy of seeing it grow by the same amount. This emotional imbalance has several tangible consequences. First, it can lead to suboptimal investment strategies. Investors, driven by the desire to avoid losses, may hold on to losing stocks for too long, hoping for a rebound that never materializes. This is the disposition effect, the tendency to sell winning investments too early and hold on to losing investments for too long. The rational course of action might be to cut one's losses and reallocate capital to more promising opportunities. But fear, a powerful current, often overrides reason. Consider also the impact on risk aversion. While the classical economist often portrays risk aversion as a static preference, behavioral economics recognizes that it can be context-dependent, influenced by the framing of the decision. If an investment is presented as a chance to avoid a loss, investors may be more willing to take risks than if the same investment is presented as a chance to achieve a gain. This framing effect, a subtle shift in perspective, can dramatically alter investment behavior. The policymaker designing pension schemes, for instance, needs to be acutely aware of how the options are presented to maximize participation and encourage prudent investment choices. The implications extend beyond individual investors. Loss aversion can also contribute to market anomalies. For example, it might amplify market crashes. As prices decline, investors become increasingly averse to further losses, leading to panic selling and a downward spiral. Conversely, during market booms, the fear of missing out can fuel speculative bubbles. Fairness and reciprocity, though perhaps less directly linked to loss aversion in investment, still play a role. The perception of fairness within the market, or a belief that rules are being applied equitably, can impact investor confidence. If investors perceive that certain actors are manipulating the market for their own gain, creating unfair losses for others, it can erode trust and lead to market instability. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond in kind to the actions of others, may manifest as copycat trading behavior, amplifying market trends. Bounded rationality, the idea that our cognitive abilities are limited, further complicates the picture. We are not perfect information processors. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to make decisions in a complex world. While these heuristics can be useful, they can also lead to biases and errors. For example, the availability heuristic, the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, might lead investors to overreact to recent news events, buying high and selling low. In essence, loss aversion, tempered by fairness perceptions, reciprocity, and the constraints of bounded rationality, creates a vibrant ecosystem of investment decisions that often diverge from the predictions of classical economic models. This is not to say that rationality is entirely absent. Rather, it is a force constantly wrestling with emotions and cognitive limitations. And so, as we consider these elements of behavioral game theory, we arrive at a question, a gentle prod toward the next phase of our exploration. How can we, as individuals and as a society, design systems and policies that acknowledge and mitigate the effects of these biases, fostering more rational and sustainable investment decisions? Chapter 28. Overconfidence and Market Bubbles. Good evening. Last time, we explored the inherent difficulties in predicting economic outcomes, highlighting the limitations of rational expectations. Tonight, we delve deeper into those limitations, specifically focusing on how overconfidence, a very human trait, contributes to the formation of market bubbles, a phenomenon perplexing for those who believe in perfect rationality. We will examine this through the lens of behavioral game theory, observing how fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality weave themselves into the fabric of market psychology. Consider the market, not as a cold, calculating machine, as the classical economist might suggest, but as a complex ecosystem, a dynamic system influenced by the collective hopes, fears, and biases of its participants. Within this ecosystem, overconfidence often blooms. It's a pervasive bias, leading individuals to overestimate their knowledge, abilities, and the accuracy of their predictions. This isn't necessarily malicious. It's simply a cognitive quirk, a shortcut our minds take to navigate an uncertain world. In the context of financial markets, overconfidence manifests as an exaggerated belief in one's ability to pick winning stocks, time the market, or assess the true value of an asset. Individuals, particularly those who have experienced recent success, may become convinced that their insights are superior, their strategies foolproof. This inflated sense of competence diminishes their perception of risk, encouraging them to take on more leverage, invest in speculative assets, and ignore dissenting opinions. The consequences of this widespread overconfidence can be dramatic. Imagine a scenario where a new technology captures the imagination of the public. Early adopters experience significant gains, fueling the perception that this technology represents the future. Overconfident investors, convinced they understand the technology better than others, rush in, driving prices upward. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Rising prices validate their initial belief, further increasing their confidence and attracting even more investors. This is the anatomy of a bubble. The price of the asset detaches from its fundamental value, driven by speculation and the fear of missing out. Reciprocity plays a role here, too. People observe their neighbors and friends becoming wealthy, and a sense of fairness, or perhaps envy, compels them to join the bandwagon. They don't want to be left behind. Bounded rationality, the recognition that our cognitive abilities are limited, further exacerbates the problem. Investors, overwhelmed by information and lacking the time or expertise to analyze it thoroughly, rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and the opinions of others. They follow the crowd, assuming that the collective wisdom must be accurate, even when it's demonstrably not. The role of fairness also enters into the fray when the bubble inevitably bursts. As prices begin to fall, panic sets in. Those who were initially drawn to the market by the promise of easy riches now feel betrayed, cheated by the system. They may engage in irrational selling, exacerbating the downturn and reinforcing the perception of injustice. The policymaker, often caught off guard, scrambles to implement measures to stabilize the market, but these efforts are often hampered by a lack of credibility and the sheer force of market sentiment. Consider the historical echoes in every major market bubble: the Dutch tulip mania, the South Sea bubble, the dot-com boom. Each serves as a cautionary tale, a testament to the power of overconfidence, the allure of quick profits, and the fragility of investor sentiment. These events highlight the inherent tension between the rational models favored by classical economics and the messy emotional realities of human behavior. And so, we arrive at a point of reflection. While models attempt to explain and predict, human behavior remains a swirling, unpredictable force. Understanding overconfidence and its role in market instability allows us to approach the world of finance with a more critical and measured perspective. But as we consider the burst of a bubble and the subsequent economic downturn, the question lingers: what mechanisms of recovery can restore equilibrium in the face of such widespread disillusionment? What role can and should the policymaker play in mitigating the long-term effects of such collective economic heartbreak? That, perhaps, is a question for our next contemplation. Behavioral game theory and political science. We've navigated the somewhat turbulent waters of traditional game theory, observing its power in modeling strategic interactions. But, like any model, it simplifies. It often assumes perfect rationality, a flawless pursuit of self-interest, and a cold indifference to the outcomes of others. Now, let us turn to a more nuanced perspective, one that acknowledges the human element. Behavioral game theory. Behavioral game theory acknowledges that individuals are often driven not just by pure self-interest, but also by considerations of fairness, reciprocity, and the limitations of their cognitive abilities, what we term bounded rationality. It suggests that our decisions in strategic situations are colored by moral considerations and our capacity to process and consider, for instance, the Ultimatum Game. The classical economist would predict a simple outcome. One player proposes a split of a sum of money, and the other accepts any offer, no matter how small, because something is better than nothing. Yet, experiments consistently show that people often reject offers they deem unfair, even if it means receiving nothing at all. This reveals a preference for fairness, a willingness to sacrifice personal gain to punish perceived injustice. This behavior is not irrational, it merely operates on a different calculus than the traditionally assumed, purely selfish model. The rejecter is acting to maintain a level of equity within the system, perhaps fostering an environment where fairness is respected for all parties. Reciprocity, another key concept, builds upon this notion of fairness. It suggests that we are inclined to reward kind actions and punish unkind ones, even when there is no immediate or future material benefit to ourselves. This is more than mere tit for tat. It's a deeper sense of moral obligation to respond to the actions of others in a consistent and equitable manner. In political negotiations, for example, one party might make a conciliatory gesture, not expecting immediate return, but hoping to foster a sense of goodwill and encourage reciprocal behavior from the other party. This is not merely calculating self-interest. It's an investment in a longer-term, more cooperative relationship. Bounded rationality is perhaps the most fundamental challenge to the classical assumption. It acknowledges that our cognitive resources are limited. We cannot perfectly analyze every possible outcome, consider every contingency, or calculate the optimal strategy in complex situations. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and simplifying assumptions to navigate the world. These shortcuts, while often helpful, can also lead to biases and errors in judgment. The policymaker, facing a complex environmental regulation, for instance, will not have access to complete information, unlimited time, or perfect analytical capabilities. They will rely on simplified models, expert opinions, and political considerations, inevitably leading to decisions that are less than perfectly optimal from a purely rational perspective. Behavioral game theory extends far beyond simple laboratory experiments. It informs our understanding of international relations, voting behavior, and even the design of public policy. For example, knowing that people are loss-averse, that they feel the pain of a loss more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain, can help in designing policies that are more likely to be accepted. Presenting a tax increase as a reduction in a potential rebate, rather than an additional payment, can significantly alter public perception and acceptance. Similarly, understanding the power of framing, how choices are presented, can influence voting behavior and shape public opinion. In essence, behavioral game theory provides a richer, more human-centered perspective on strategic interactions. It acknowledges the limitations of rationality, the importance of fairness and reciprocity, and the influence of cognitive biases. This perspective is not a rejection of classical game theory. Rather, it is an enrichment, adding depth and nuance to our understanding of human behavior. It encourages us to see individuals not as perfectly rational actors, but as complex beings with emotions, values, and cognitive limitations. How then might we further refine our models to better incorporate the dynamic interplay between individual psychology and broader societal structures? A question that leads us into our next discussion. Voting behavior, cognitive biases, and social influence. Good evening. We've traversed the intricate landscapes of rational choice, assumption by assumption, exploring how individuals should behave in the voting booth. But the real world, as we know, is rarely so tidy. Tonight, we gently shift our perspective, acknowledging the currents of behavioral game theory that often steer voters away from purely rational decisions. We'll consider fairness, reciprocity, and the limits of our cognitive processing capabilities, all impacting the democratic process. At the heart of traditional economic models lies the assumption of homo economicus, the rational, self-interested agent. In voting, this translates to weighing policies solely on their personal benefit, then selecting the option that maximizes individual utility. Behavioral game theory, however, casts a more nuanced light. It recognizes that voters are not islands, but are embedded in complex social networks and are subject to psychological biases. Fairness, for instance, often overrides pure self-interest. Imagine two policies, one that benefits you greatly but disadvantages a vulnerable group, and another that offers you a smaller personal gain, but promotes greater equality. The classical economist, driven solely by personal utility maximization, would unhesitatingly choose the former. Yet, research consistently shows that many voters exhibit altruistic punishment. They are willing to incur a cost to themselves to penalize unfair behavior, even if it doesn't directly benefit them. This sense of fairness, this aversion to inequity, acts as a powerful gravitational force, pulling voting choices away from the purely rational. Reciprocity adds another layer of complexity. This is the tendency to respond in kind, rewarding kindness and punishing unkindness. In the context of voting, this might manifest as supporting a candidate who has championed policies that previously benefited your community, even if their current platform isn't perfectly aligned with your immediate self-interest. Conversely, a candidate perceived as having harmed your group in the past may face significant resistance, regardless of their current promises. Reciprocity creates a feedback loop, influencing voting decisions based on past interactions and perceived trust, rather than solely on calculated future gains. Bounded rationality, as the name suggests, acknowledges the inherent limitations of human cognition. We cannot possibly process all available information, evaluate every possible outcome, and predict the future with perfect accuracy. Our minds are not supercomputers, they are pattern-seeking machines, prone to simplifying heuristics and cognitive biases. Consider confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. A voter already predisposed to supporting a particular party will likely consume news from sources aligned with that party, reinforcing their views and making them less receptive to opposing arguments. This creates an echo chamber, distorting their perception of reality and further polarizing the electorate. The policymaker, grappling with the complexities of voter behavior, must therefore understand these biases. Traditional campaign strategies, focused solely on presenting rational arguments and appealing to self-interest, may fall flat. Instead, appeals to fairness, empathy, and a sense of shared responsibility may prove more effective. Understanding the power of social influence and the role of trusted community leaders in shaping opinions is also crucial. It's important to recognize that these cognitive biases are not necessarily flaws. They are often adaptive strategies, evolved to help us navigate a complex world with limited information. However, they can also lead to suboptimal outcomes in the democratic process, distorting the collective will and undermining the principles of informed consent. As we prepare to conclude, reflect on the intricate interplay between rationality and behavior. We've seen how fairness, reciprocity, and the inherent limits of our minds shape voter decisions. But as we seek to understand the flow of economic decision-making, we must ask what tools might we employ to counteract the influence of inherent biases, and how can we achieve a better balance between intuition and reason. This equilibrium will be the focus of our next exploration. Chapter 31. Negotiation and Bargaining. Fairness and Power Dynamics. Consider the bargaining table not as a stage for perfectly rational actors, but as a complex ecosystem. Within this ecosystem, the classical assumptions of self-interest often clash with deeply ingrained notions of fairness. The classical economists might posit that individuals will relentlessly pursue their maximum utility, accepting any offer, however small, that surpasses their outside option. Yet, experiments consistently reveal a different picture. People often reject offers they deem unfair, even when those offers represent a tangible gain. This isn't irrationality, but rather a manifestation of a broader preference, a preference for equitable outcomes, even at a personal cost. The concept of fairness is, of course, a slippery one. What constitutes a just division is often context-dependent, influenced by social norms, perceived entitlements, and the relative contributions of the parties involved. Imagine splitting a pot of money after a joint venture. If one partner contributed significantly more effort or resources, a 50-50 split might be perceived as unjust by the harder-working individual, even if it's mathematically fair in the simplistic sense. Behavioral game theory seeks to understand these subjective perceptions and their impact on bargaining outcomes. Hand in hand with fairness walks reciprocity. This powerful human tendency to respond in kind, to repay kindness with kindness and aggression with aggression, profoundly alters strategic interactions. A negotiator who adopts a collaborative, trustworthy approach is far more likely to elicit a similar response from their counterpart. Conversely, a belligerent, uncompromising stance can trigger a cycle of escalation, leading to suboptimal outcomes for all involved. Reciprocity acts as a self-regulating mechanism, promoting cooperation and punishing defection. It's a delicate dance, where trust is both a valuable asset and a potential vulnerability. Bounded rationality introduces another layer of complexity. The assumption of perfect rationality, the ability to flawlessly calculate optimal strategies in every situation, is often unrealistic. In reality, our cognitive capacities are limited. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and simplifying assumptions to navigate the world. These cognitive biases can lead to systematic deviations from the predictions of classical game theory. For example, framing effects demonstrate how the way information is presented can influence our choices, even if the underlying economic reality remains the same. A negotiation, framed in terms of potential gains, might elicit a different response than the same negotiation framed in terms of potential losses. The policymaker, grappling with real-world challenges, must understand these behavioral nuances to design effective interventions. Policies that ignore the importance of fairness and reciprocity may be met with resistance or unintended consequences. For instance, a tax system perceived as unduly burdensome by certain groups may lead to widespread tax evasion, even if the economic rationale behind the system is sound. Similarly, negotiation strategies that explicitly acknowledge and address concerns about fairness are more likely to yield successful outcomes. Power dynamics, interwoven with fairness and bounded rationality, further complicate the bargaining process. A party with greater power may be tempted to exploit its advantage, pushing for an outcome that heavily favors its own interests. However, such behavior can backfire, eroding trust and damaging long-term relationships. A more nuanced approach involves using power strategically, recognizing that fairness and reciprocity can ultimately lead to more sustainable and mutually beneficial agreement. The illusion of control through raw power can be seductive, but sustainable success lies in understanding the underlying psychological currents. Behavioral game theory, therefore, offers a richer, more realistic perspective on negotiation and bargaining. It acknowledges the limitations of pure rationality and recognizes the profound influence of fairness, reciprocity, and cognitive biases. It encourages us to view the bargaining table not as a battleground, but as a space for dialogue, understanding, and the creation of mutually beneficial value. The study of its interplay with traditional power dynamics remains an active area of research, perpetually evolving as we refine our understanding of human behavior. But what about the longer-term impact? As AI and machine learning algorithms become increasingly sophisticated negotiators, will these considerations of fairness and reciprocity fade into the background, replaced by cold, calculated optimization? Or will the human desire for equitable outcomes continue to shape the future of bargaining, even in a world increasingly dominated by artificial intelligence? That, perhaps, is a question for our next exploration. Chapter 32. Behavioral Approaches to Conflict Resolution. Welcome back. We've journeyed through the formal landscapes of game theory, mapping strategies and equilibria with elegant, albeit sometimes sterile, precision. But the human heart, as we know, rarely adheres perfectly to rational calculations. And it is this deviation, this fascinating, messy, and ultimately vital departure that we explore tonight. Tonight's focus, specifically, is how insights from behavioral economics, particularly behavioral game theory, offer invaluable tools for navigating and resolving conflict. We shall be looking at three key ingredients of this approach: fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. Let us begin with fairness. The classical economist often assumes individuals are purely self-interested, maximizing their own utility regardless of the consequences for others. However, countless experiments and real-world observations demonstrate that people care, sometimes a great deal, about fairness. This isn't merely altruism, although that plays a part. It's a deeply ingrained sense of equity and justice. Imagine a simple bargaining game. Two individuals must divide a sum of money. The rational outcome, from a purely self-interested perspective, might be one person taking almost everything. Yet, offers perceived as unfair are routinely rejected, even if it means the recipient gets nothing at all. This isn't irrational. It reflects a prioritization of fairness, a desire to punish perceived inequity. The implications for conflict resolution are profound. Disputes often arise not solely from differing material interests, but from perceived injustices. The policymaker, mediating a labor dispute, might find that a compromise perceived as fair by both sides, even if it doesn't maximize individual gains, is far more likely to lead to a lasting resolution. Recognizing and addressing these fairness concerns, even when they seem irrational from a classical perspective, is crucial. We could look at international trade negotiations, for example. The perception of an unequal trade agreement could spark conflicts and make agreements more difficult. Next, we turn to reciprocity. Human beings are wired to respond to actions in kind. Kindness begets kindness. Hostility begets hostility. This seemingly simple principle has far-reaching consequences in strategic interactions. In game theory terms, reciprocity can be understood as a form of conditional cooperation. Individuals are more likely to cooperate if they believe others will reciprocate, and more likely to defect if they anticipate defection. This creates a delicate dance of trust and suspicion. The classical economist might model these interactions as one-shot games, where cooperation is always dominated by defection. But, in repeated interactions, the shadow of the future looms large. The anticipation of future interactions, the potential for reciprocal rewards or punishments, fundamentally alters the strategic landscape. Consider a protracted legal battle. Both sides could, in theory, pursue relentless litigation, driving up costs and prolonging the conflict. However, a willingness to compromise, to offer concessions, can signal a desire for cooperation and trigger reciprocal concessions from the other side, leading to a mutually beneficial settlement. Why? The key is to establish a credible commitment to reciprocity, to demonstrate that cooperation will be rewarded and defection will be punished. Finally, we must grapple with bounded rationality. The classical economist often assumes perfect information, unlimited cognitive abilities, and flawless calculation. In reality, human beings are limited by their cognitive capacities, their access to information, and their susceptibility to biases. We simplify complex problems, use heuristics, and rely on intuition. This isn't necessarily a flaw. It's a necessary adaptation to a complex world. But it can also lead to systematic errors in judgment, particularly in situations of conflict. Consider, for instance, the escalation of commitment, the tendency to pour more resources into a failing project, simply because we've already invested so much. This can be particularly destructive in conflicts, as parties become entrenched in their positions, unwilling to admit defeat or compromise, even when it's clearly in their best interest. Recognizing these cognitive limitations and developing strategies to mitigate their impact is essential for effective conflict resolution. This might involve seeking advice from neutral third parties, framing issues in different ways, or simply taking a step back to gain a fresh perspective. By acknowledging fairness concerns, harnessing the power of reciprocity, and accounting for bounded rationality, we can move beyond the sterile predictions of classical game theory and develop a more nuanced and effective approach to conflict resolution. We begin to understand conflicts less as cold calculations and more as complex human dramas. The river of conflict flows more smoothly if we understand these eddies and currents. Our journey through behavioral game theory has only just begun. We've explored fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality as they relate to conflict resolution. But how do these behavioral insights influence broader economic phenomena, such as market dynamics and the allocation of resources in societies exhibiting structural inequalities? That will be our point of entry next time. Behavioral game theory and law. We've spent considerable time exploring the elegant, though sometimes sterile, world of traditional game theory. Now, imagine we introduce a bit of human messiness into the equation. The biases, the emotions, the quirks that make us, well, us. This leads us into the fascinating and often frustrating realm of behavioral game theory. Behavioral game theory acknowledges that individuals rarely behave according to the perfectly rational, self-interested model so beloved by the classical economist. Instead, our decisions are often colored by notions of fairness, driven by a desire for reciprocity, and constrained by our cognitive limitations, a concept known as bounded rationality. Think of it as introducing friction into a frictionless system. Let's consider fairness first. Traditional game theory assumes that players are solely motivated by maximizing their own payoffs. However, numerous experiments, most notably the Ultimatum Game, reveal a different story. In the Ultimatum Game, one player is given a sum of money and tasked with offering a portion of it to the other player. The second player can either accept the offer, in which case both players receive the proposed amounts, or reject it, in which case neither player receives anything. Theoretically, any offer above zero should be accepted. A penny is better than nothing, right? Yet, proposers frequently offer closer to a 50-50 split, and responders often reject offers deemed unfairly low, even if it means receiving nothing at all. This suggests that individuals value fairness, even at a personal cost. Our aversion to inequity, it seems, is deeply ingrained. This has profound implications for legal and policy design, for how disputes are resolved, and how contracts are negotiated. Next, we turn to reciprocity. This is the idea that people tend to respond to kindness with kindness and to unkindness with unkindness. It's the tit-for-tat strategy elevated to a fundamental human principle. Again, this deviates significantly from the standard game theoretic assumption of purely selfish actors. Imagine two firms engaged in repeated interaction. The classical economist would predict relentless competition and attempts to exploit any advantage. However, behavioral game theory suggests that repeated interaction can foster cooperation, as firms learn to reciprocate beneficial behavior and punish opportunistic behavior. The legal system can leverage reciprocity. Laws designed to promote cooperation by providing incentives for good behavior and disincentives for bad behavior are more likely to be effective than purely punitive measures. Consider environmental regulations, for instance. A system that rewards companies for reducing emissions may be more successful in the long run than one that simply punishes them for exceeding limits. The policymaker needs to understand this flow. Finally, we confront bounded rationality. Humans are not supercomputers. We have limited cognitive abilities, imperfect information, and emotional biases that cloud our judgment. We often rely on heuristics, or mental shortcuts, to make decisions quickly, even if those shortcuts sometimes lead to suboptimal outcomes. This is especially important in complex legal contexts. For example, consider consumer protection law. The classical economist might assume that consumers are rational actors who carefully weigh the costs and benefits of every purchase. However, behavioral game theory recognizes that consumers are often influenced by framing effects, cognitive biases, and the complexity of information. Laws requiring clear and simple disclosure of information, for instance, can help consumers make more informed decisions, even if they don't have the time or inclination to read the fine print. It's about nudging the system towards balance. So, what does all of this mean for law and policy? It suggests that we need to move beyond the assumption of perfect rationality and embrace a more nuanced understanding of human behavior. Laws and regulations should be designed not only to incentivize optimal outcomes, but also to address cognitive biases, promote fairness, and foster cooperation. This requires a deeper understanding of psychology, sociology, and the complex interplay of human motivations. Behavioral game theory offers a powerful lens through which to examine the legal system and the behavior it attempts to regulate. But how can we best integrate these insights into practical legal design? And what are the ethical implications of using behavioral techniques to nudge individuals towards specific choices? These are the questions that will guide us as we continue this journey. As the waters flow into the next valley. Chapter 34. Contract Design. Enforcing cooperation. We've navigated the shadowed landscapes of incomplete information, observing how asymmetric knowledge shapes choices. Now, let's shift our focus from information gaps to the equally critical, and perhaps more human, dimensions of cooperation. How do we design contracts, the scaffolding of economic activity, to foster collaboration when individuals aren't always the perfectly rational actors imagined in classical models? We enter the realm of behavioral game theory. The classical economist often posits that individuals are self-interested, utility maximizers, meticulously calculating costs and benefits. But the reality, as we all instinctively know, is far more nuanced. People are influenced by fairness, reciprocity, and crucially, cognitive limitations, a concept known as bounded rationality. These factors, often dismissed as irrational by traditional economics, profoundly impact how contracts function and whether cooperation flourishes or falters. Consider fairness. The Ultimatum Game, a simple yet revealing experiment, demonstrates this powerfully. One player receives a sum of money and proposes how to divide it with another. The second player can either accept the offer, in which case the money is divided as proposed, or reject it, in which case both players receive nothing. The classical economist predicts that the first player will offer the smallest possible amount, and the second player will accept it, since something is better than nothing. Yet, Empirical evidence consistently shows that low offers are frequently rejected. Why? Because the second player perceives the offer as unfair, and the disutility of being treated unfairly outweighs the small gain they would receive. Contracts built solely on maximizing individual monetary gain, without considering perceptions of fairness, are likely to be unstable and prone to breakdown. Reciprocity, the inclination to respond to kindness with kindness, and to unkindness with unkindness, further complicates the picture. A contract that is seen as exploitative, even if technically legal, can trigger negative reciprocity, leading to reduced effort, sabotage, or even outright breach. Conversely, a contract that is perceived as fair and respectful can elicit positive reciprocity, motivating parties to go above and beyond what is explicitly stipulated. This concept flows through the veins of long-term business relationships, where trust and goodwill can prove far more valuable than strictly enforced legal terms. Bounded rationality introduces a different kind of friction. Individuals have limited cognitive capacity. They cannot perfectly process all available information or foresee all possible contingencies. Complex, overly detailed contracts, intended to anticipate every potential scenario, can paradoxically become counterproductive. The cognitive burden of understanding and complying with such contracts can lead to errors, misunderstandings, and ultimately, non-compliance. Simpler, more flexible contracts, focused on broad principles and allowing for adaptation to changing circumstances, are often more effective. The goal is to create a framework that guides behavior without overwhelming cognitive resources. Contract design, therefore, becomes an exercise in balancing competing considerations. How do we create incentives that align individual self-interest with collective goals, while also acknowledging the human dimensions of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality? The policymaker must consider not only the explicit terms of the contract, but also the implicit signals it sends about trust, respect, and shared values. Clear communication, transparency, and a willingness to negotiate in good faith can all contribute to building a foundation of trust that supports long-term cooperation. The incorporation of behavioral insights into contract design is an ongoing process, a constant calibration between theoretical models and empirical observation. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. The optimal contract depends on the specific context, the nature of the parties involved, and the goals they are trying to achieve. It's a delicate dance between incentives, psychology, and the enduring human need for fair and reciprocal relationships. Looking ahead, as we refine our understanding of how these behavioral factors interact within economic systems, we must consider the evolutionary trajectory of contract design. If fairness and reciprocity are so fundamental, how have contract structures evolved to either harness or circumvent these powerful impulses? And, as societies become increasingly complex and interconnected, how will contract design adapt to the challenges of fostering cooperation on a global scale? Chapter 35. Criminal Justice, Deterrence and Rehabilitation. Good evening. We've journeyed through the labyrinth of market failures and government interventions. Tonight, we turn our gaze to a domain where these concepts intersect with profound human consequences: the criminal justice system. Our focus will be on the economics underpinning deterrence and rehabilitation, viewed through the lens of behavioral game theory, specifically fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. The prevailing paradigm in traditional economics, when applied to crime, often revolves around the rational actor model. Individuals weigh the expected benefits of criminal activity against the expected costs, the probability of apprehension multiplied by the severity of punishment. If the costs outweigh the benefits, the theory goes, crime is deterred. This, however, is a simplified view of a much more complex reality. Behavioral economics challenges this assumption by incorporating psychological insights into our understanding of decision-making. Fairness, in the context of criminal justice, is multifaceted. It encompasses procedural fairness, the perception that the legal process is just and unbiased, and distributive fairness, the equitable allocation of resources and penalties. When individuals perceive the system as unfair, it can erode trust and legitimacy, potentially leading to increased recidivism. Consider, for instance, communities where police brutality is prevalent. The perceived injustice may foster resentment and a willingness to engage in criminal behavior, regardless of the potential consequences. The rational calculus is disrupted by emotional responses to perceived injustice. Reciprocity, another key element of behavioral game theory, highlights the human tendency to respond in kind to the actions of others. A system perceived as punitive and lacking in opportunities for redemption might trigger negative reciprocity, a desire for revenge or a rejection of societal norms. Conversely, a system that offers genuine opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration can foster positive reciprocity, a willingness to abide by the law and contribute to society. Think of restorative justice programs that emphasize dialogue between offenders and victims. These programs aim to foster empathy and accountability, potentially leading to a greater sense of responsibility and a lower likelihood of reoffending. It's a delicate balancing act, encouraging remorse while acknowledging the need for accountability. Bounded rationality, a concept we've touched upon before, acknowledges that individuals have limited cognitive abilities, time constraints, and access to information. The classical economist might assume perfect knowledge and flawless calculation. However, in reality, potential offenders may not accurately assess the probability of getting caught or the severity of the punishment. They might be influenced by impulsive behavior, peer pressure, or addiction, all of which impair their ability to make rational decisions. The policymaker, therefore, cannot simply rely on increasing the severity of punishment as a deterrent. They must also consider strategies to improve information dissemination, address underlying social and economic factors that contribute to crime, and provide support for individuals struggling with addiction or mental health issues. The implications for policy are significant. A purely punitive approach, focused solely on deterrence through harsh penalties, may be less effective than a more nuanced strategy that incorporates elements of fairness, reciprocity, and an understanding of bounded rationality. Investing in rehabilitation programs, providing access to education and employment opportunities, and addressing systemic inequalities can be more effective in reducing crime in the long run. This requires a shift in perspective, from viewing offenders as inherently evil to recognizing them as individuals who have made choices within a specific set of constraints and circumstances. It also necessitates a more holistic approach to criminal justice reform. We must consider not only the individual offender, but also the broader social and economic context in which crime occurs. Addressing poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity can significantly reduce the incentive for criminal behavior. Such multifaceted systems are more efficient and effective overall. Our exploration this evening suggests that the economics of criminal justice is not simply about calculating costs and benefits. It is about understanding the complex interplay of human behavior, social norms, and institutional structures. It's about recognizing that individuals are not always perfectly rational actors, and that fairness and reciprocity play a crucial role in shaping their decisions. And as we begin to consider the ethical dimensions of economic decision-making, we must consider, how do we balance the desire for efficiency with the imperative of social justice? Chapter 36. Behavioral Game Theory and Environmental Policy. We've traversed the landscape of environmental economics, noting the elegant dance of supply and demand, the shadow of externalities, and the promise of corrective policies. Now, let us drift into a realm where the cool logic of classical economics encounters the warm, often unpredictable, currents of human behavior. We speak of behavioral game theory, a perspective that acknowledges the limitations of pure rationality. The classical economist, ever the champion of perfect rationality, assumes individuals act solely to maximize their own material well-being. This forms the bedrock of many game-theoretic models used to analyze environmental problems, from pollution treaties to resource management. However, real-world behavior often deviates from this idealized picture. We are not always perfectly rational actors. We are creatures of habit, emotion, and imperfect information. Consider the issue of fairness. In many environmental scenarios, cooperation hinges on a perception of just outcomes. Imagine two nations sharing a river. If one nation disproportionately pollutes the river while benefiting immensely from it, the other nation is likely to resist any cooperative agreement, even if on paper, some agreement would be Pareto improving. The perceived unfairness outweighs the potential gains, triggering a breakdown in cooperation. Behavioral game theory incorporates these concerns, recognizing that individuals are often willing to sacrifice some material gain to uphold principles of fairness and equity. Related to fairness is the principle of reciprocity. We are, by nature, social beings, attuned to the actions of others. When someone acts kindly towards us, we feel a compulsion to reciprocate. Conversely, if someone violates a social norm or acts unfairly, we may feel compelled to punish them, even at a cost to ourselves. This is known as negative reciprocity. In the context of environmental policy, reciprocity can be a powerful force. If a community sees that its neighbors are making genuine efforts to reduce pollution, it is more likely to adopt similar behaviors. Conversely, if some individuals or nations are perceived as free-riding, others may be less inclined to cooperate. And then there's the matter of bounded rationality. The classical economist assumes we possess perfect information and unlimited cognitive capacity to process it. In reality, we are constrained by the limits of our minds and the vast complexity of the world around us. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to make decisions. These heuristics can lead to systematic biases and errors in judgment. For example, people may overestimate the probability of rare, dramatic events, like major oil spills, while underestimating the cumulative impact of more frequent, less visible forms of pollution. What implications does this have for the policymaker? First, it underscores the importance of designing environmental policies that are perceived as fair and equitable. A policy that is seen as unfairly burdening one group while benefiting another is unlikely to be successful. Second, it suggests that fostering a sense of community and shared responsibility can be a powerful tool for promoting environmental cooperation. Highlighting examples of positive reciprocity and social norms can encourage others to follow suit. Finally, it calls for policies that are simple, transparent, and easy to understand, recognizing the limitations of human cognition. Complex regulations that are difficult to navigate are likely to be less effective. By integrating behavioral insights into our economic models, we can gain a more nuanced and realistic understanding of how individuals and societies respond to environmental challenges. This, in turn, can lead to more effective and sustainable policies. But as we adapt our understanding of incentives and governance, will the underlying economic engines adapt again, becoming yet more complex? Where will this leave the practice of environmental policy, forever chasing a moving target? Chapter 37. Encouraging Sustainable Behavior. Nudges and incentives. We've explored the intricate dance of markets and regulations, observing how they seek to guide human action towards specific economic goals. Now, let us consider a more nuanced approach, one that recognizes the fascinating quirks and inherent limitations of human decision-making. Behavioral game theory. This is where the concepts of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality come into play. For centuries, the classical economists built elegant models assuming rational actors, individuals who meticulously weigh costs and benefits, perfectly informed, and relentlessly self-interested. These models, while mathematically beautiful, often struggled to predict real-world behavior. Why? Because humans, as it turns out, are not purely rational calculating machines. We are driven by a complex interplay of emotions, social norms, and cognitive biases. Consider fairness. A purely rational actor, maximizing their own utility, might be perfectly content to exploit an opportunity, regardless of the impact on others. Yet, countless studies reveal that people are often willing to sacrifice personal gain to avoid perceived unfairness. The Ultimatum Game, a simple yet profound experiment, demonstrates this vividly. One player is given a sum of money and asked to propose a split with another player. The second player can either accept the offer, in which case the money is divided as proposed, or reject it, in which case both players receive nothing. Logically, any offer above zero should be accepted. But low offers, even those slightly above zero, are frequently rejected. Why? Because the second player perceives the offer as unfair, and the desire for fairness overrides the desire for a small monetary gain. The drive for equity, for a sense of just distribution, becomes a powerful force. Closely linked to fairness is the concept of reciprocity. We are not simply concerned with what is fair to us. We are also inclined to reciprocate kindness and punish unkindness. This principle shapes our interactions in countless ways, from tipping in restaurants to collaborating in teams. If someone performs a favor for us, we feel a sense of obligation to return the favor. Conversely, if someone treats us poorly, we may be willing to incur a cost to retaliate. This intrinsic inclination toward reciprocal behavior is not always captured by traditional economic models, which tend to emphasize self-interest as the primary motivator. However, the most pervasive challenge to the classical model is the concept of bounded rationality. We, as humans, are simply incapable of processing all the information required to make perfectly rational decisions. Our cognitive resources are limited. We rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to simplify complex problems. These heuristics, while often helpful, can also lead to systematic biases. The availability heuristic, for instance, leads us to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, such as dramatic news stories. The anchoring bias leads us to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we receive, even if it is irrelevant. Recognizing these inherent limitations, the policymaker has begun to embrace the insights of behavioral economics. Instead of assuming perfect rationality, they attempt to design policies that work with, rather than against, human tendencies. This is the realm of nudges and incentives. A nudge is a subtle intervention that steers people toward a desired behavior without restricting their freedom of choice. For example, automatically enrolling employees in a retirement savings plan, but allowing them to opt out, significantly increases participation rates. This utilizes our tendency toward inertia, our inclination to stick with the default option. Similarly, framing information in a particular way can influence choices. Presenting energy consumption data with comparisons to neighbors can motivate people to conserve energy. Nudges are gentle pushes, designed to guide us in beneficial directions without coercion. Incentives, on the other hand, involve altering the costs and benefits associated with different choices. Taxes on sugary drinks, for instance, incentivize healthier consumption habits. Subsidies for renewable energy sources encourage the adoption of cleaner technologies. Incentives work by directly altering the rational calculus, making desired behaviors more attractive and undesirable behaviors less so. The key to effective policy design lies in understanding the interplay between these approaches. Nudges can be powerful tools for overcoming inertia and cognitive biases. Incentives can provide a more direct motivation for change. The challenge is to find the right combination, tailored to the specific context and the particular behavior being targeted. The ethical considerations are paramount, ensuring that these interventions are transparent and respectful of individual autonomy. We are not simply seeking to manipulate behavior, but rather to empower individuals to make better choices, aligning personal well-being with the collective good. As we navigate this landscape, we see how traditional notions of rationality are reshaped by the understanding of human behavior. It begs the question, what new frameworks will emerge as the dance between human intuition and economic realities continues to evolve? How will we continue to refine our understanding of this intricate interplay in the coming years? The pursuit of this deeper understanding, that is a path we will explore next. Chapter 38: Climate Change Negotiations. Overcoming the collective action problem, we've explored the stark realities of climate change, its projected impacts, and the initial failures of purely rational economic models to inspire meaningful action. Now, let us turn our attention to a richer understanding of human behavior, one that goes beyond the simplistic assumption of perfect rationality. We delve into the realm of behavioral game theory, a perspective that recognizes the powerful influences of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality on our collective decision-making. The standard, classical economist often paints a picture of individuals maximizing their own self-interests. blissfully impervious to the actions or welfare of others. In the context of climate change, this translates to nations pursuing their own economic growth, externalizing the environmental costs onto the global commons. The result is a classic tragedy of the commons. Each nation benefits from inaction, but the cumulative effect is disastrous for all. Traditional game theory predicts this outcome, and the historical record, sadly, often confirms it. However, behavioral game theory suggests a more nuanced reality. It recognizes that humans are not purely self-regarding automatons. We are often driven by a sense of fairness, a desire for reciprocity, and an acceptance of our own cognitive limitations. These factors can significantly alter the dynamics of international negotiations, especially those concerning global challenges like climate change. Consider the concept of fairness. The policymaker, facing the complexities of international negotiations, is often confronted with the question of burden sharing. Should all nations bear an equal responsibility for mitigating climate change, regardless of their historical contributions to the problem? Or should nations with greater historical emissions, and therefore greater culpability, bear a disproportionately larger share of the burden? The classical economist might argue for efficiency, allocating resources to where they yield the greatest reductions in emissions. But behavioral game theory acknowledges that perceived unfairness can derail negotiations, even if the efficient outcome is collectively beneficial. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond in kind to the actions of others, also plays a crucial role. A nation that perceives another as acting in bad faith, shirking its responsibilities, is likely to reciprocate with similar inaction. Conversely, a nation that observes another making genuine efforts to reduce emissions is more likely to be motivated to do the same. This creates the possibility of a virtuous cycle where cooperative behavior breeds further cooperation. The flow of trust, once initiated, can gradually erode the barriers to collective action. But even with the best intentions, our decision-making is often constrained by bounded rationality. We are not perfectly informed, we have limited cognitive resources, and we often rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to navigate complex situations. The sheer scale and complexity of climate change can be overwhelming, leading to paralysis or the adoption of suboptimal strategies. The intricate web of economic models, scientific projections, and political considerations often exceeds our capacity to process it effectively. Furthermore, framing effects can significantly influence our perceptions of climate change risks and the effectiveness of potential solutions. Presenting climate change as a potential catastrophe, for example, might induce panic and inaction. Framing it as an opportunity for innovation and sustainable growth, on the other hand, might be more conducive to proactive measures. So, how can behavioral game theory inform the design of more effective climate change agreements? Firstly, by recognizing the importance of fairness, we can strive for burden-sharing arrangements that are perceived as equitable by all parties. This might involve differentiated targets, technology transfer, or financial assistance to developing nations. Secondly, by fostering reciprocity, we can create mechanisms that reward cooperative behavior and penalize free riding. This could involve establishing credible monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, as well as promoting transparency in emissions reporting. Finally, by acknowledging bounded rationality, we can simplify the complexities of climate change and make the information more accessible and understandable to both policymakers and the public. This might involve developing clear and concise communication strategies, promoting climate literacy, and engaging citizens in the decision-making process. The application of behavioral insights to climate change negotiations offers a glimmer of hope amidst the challenges we face. By moving beyond the rigid assumptions of perfect rationality, we can design policies that are more attuned to the realities of human behavior. But even with a deeper understanding of fairness, reciprocity, and cognitive limitations, a lingering question remains. How do we reconcile the long-term horizons of climate change with the short-term pressures of political cycles and electoral considerations? What role will intertemporal choice play in shaping our climate future? This, then, is a question we will explore in the coming segment. The replication crisis in social sciences. Tonight, Let's gently navigate from the shifting sands of neoclassical thought to a somewhat turbulent, yet equally fascinating, area: the replication crisis within the social sciences, particularly as it pertains to behavioral game theory. You see, the elegance and perceived predictability of rational choice models, while intellectually pleasing, often falter when confronted with the messy reality of human behavior. Behavioral game theory, seeking to bridge this gap, incorporated concepts like fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. But its very reliance on empirical observation made it vulnerable to the scrutiny that has come to define the replication crisis. Consider the core tenets. Fairness, a seemingly simple concept, suggests that individuals don't always maximize their own material payoffs. In ultimatum games, for instance, the classical economist would expect a proposer to offer the smallest possible amount and a responder to accept anything above zero, as something is better than nothing. Yet, countless experiments reveal that responders frequently reject offers deemed unfair, even at a personal cost. This observation prompted the development of models incorporating fairness preferences, where utility is not solely derived from self-interest, but also from a sense of equitable outcomes. Reciprocity, another pillar, expands upon this notion. It posits that individuals are inclined to reward kindness and punish unkindness, even when doing so doesn't directly benefit them. In repeated interactions, this can lead to the emergence of cooperative strategies that defy the predictions of purely self-interested game theory. Think of it as a social thermostat, adjusting behavior based on perceived intentions and actions of others. Again, empirical studies seem to confirm these tendencies, suggesting a deeper, more nuanced understanding of strategic interaction. Finally, bounded rationality acknowledges the inherent limitations of human cognition. We don't possess the infinite computational power and perfect information assumed by traditional models. Instead, we rely on heuristics, rules of thumb, and simplified mental models to make decisions. This can lead to systematic biases and deviations from optimal choices, as demonstrated by phenomena like framing effects and cognitive illusions. This is not to suggest irrationality, but rather a rationality constrained by cognitive resources. Now, where does the replication crisis enter this picture? The issue lies not necessarily with the ideas themselves, but with the evidence supporting them. Many of the initial studies demonstrating these behavioral effects, while groundbreaking, suffered from methodological limitations. Small sample sizes, publication bias, and the flexibility in data analysis, known as p-hacking, all contributed to an overestimation of the true effect sizes. Think of it as a finely calibrated instrument, slowly drifting out of alignment. As the field matured, researchers began to revisit these earlier findings with larger, more rigorous studies. And, in many cases, the previously observed effects diminished or disappeared altogether. While fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality remain conceptually compelling, the strength and generalizability of the empirical evidence supporting them has come under intense scrutiny. The policymaker, relying on these insights to design effective interventions, found herself standing on shifting ground. This crisis of replication is not unique to behavioral game theory. It plagues many areas of social science. It serves as a potent reminder of the importance of methodological rigor, transparency, and replication in scientific research. It compels us to view initial findings with a healthy dose of skepticism and to prioritize studies that are pre-registered, employ large samples, and adhere to the highest standards of statistical analysis. The initial rush to embrace these new behavioral insights has given way to a more measured, cautious approach. The flood of initial enthusiasm has receded, leaving behind the task of carefully charting the true course of these powerful ideas. So, where does this leave behavioral game theory? Certainly not defunct. It has forced the field to become more self-aware, more critical of its own methods, and more committed to the principles of sound scientific inquiry. But it also raises a fundamental question. If the initial evidence was weaker than we thought, are we truly capturing the essence of human behavior in these models? Or are we merely constructing elaborate frameworks around statistical artifacts? Perhaps the next phase of economic thought will involve a deeper exploration of the context in which these behaviors emerge, a consideration often overlooked in our quest for universal principles. What new frameworks await us on the horizon? Chapter 40, Meta-Analysis and Publication Bias. Last time, we explored the intriguing ways that framing effects can subtly shape economic decisions. Tonight, we turn our attention to a critical aspect of behavioral game theory: how we synthesize the vast, sometimes conflicting, body of experimental evidence, and how potential biases might skew our understanding of fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. This brings us to the domain of meta-analysis and the pervasive issue of publication bias. Meta-analysis, at its core, is a process of systematically combining the results of multiple studies addressing a shared research question. Think of it as a grand synthesis, a distillation of individual findings into a more robust and reliable conclusion. Imagine a flowing river, fed by countless streams, each study representing a small tributary. Meta-analysis attempts to chart the main current, identifying the overall direction and strength of the evidence. For behavioral game theory, with its reliance on experimental data, meta-analysis is particularly valuable. It allows us to move beyond individual, sometimes noisy, results and discern broader patterns. For example, consider the Ultimatum Game, a cornerstone of research on fairness. Numerous studies have investigated the factors that influence offers and acceptance rates. A meta-analysis could aggregate these findings to determine the average offer proportion, the impact of stake size on proposer generosity, or the role of cultural differences in shaping fairness norms. By pooling the data from numerous experiments, we can obtain more precise estimates of these parameters and increase our confidence in the conclusions. However, the process of gathering and synthesizing evidence is not without its challenges. One significant hurdle is publication bias, also known as the file drawer problem. This refers to the tendency for studies with statistically significant results to be more likely to be published than those with null or inconclusive findings. Imagine a vast library, where only the books with exciting attention-grabbing plots are displayed prominently, while the more nuanced and less sensational stories are relegated to the dusty back shelves. This selective publication can distort the overall picture, leading to an overestimation of the true effect size. The implications for behavioral game theory are profound. If studies that find strong evidence of fairness, reciprocity, or bounded rationality are more likely to be published than those that do not, we may be painting an overly optimistic picture of the prevalence and importance of these behavioral factors in economic decision-making. The classical economist, clinging to assumptions of perfect rationality, might find solace in the unpublished negative results, suggesting the influence of these behavioral quirks is less pervasive than the published literature indicates. Conversely, the policymaker, eager to design interventions that promote cooperation and fairness, may overestimate the impact of behavioral nudges based on a biased sample of studies. Detecting publication bias is a crucial step in any meta-analysis. Several statistical methods can be employed to assess the presence of this bias, such as funnel plots and Egger's test. Funnel plots visually represent the relationship between effect size and sample size. In the absence of publication bias, the plot should resemble an inverted funnel, with studies clustered around the true effect size and spreading out as sample size decreases. Asymmetry in the funnel suggests that smaller studies with null or negative results are missing from the literature. Egger's test provides a statistical assessment of this asymmetry. If publication bias is detected, researchers can employ techniques such as trim and fill methods to adjust the meta-analytic estimates for the missing studies. Addressing publication bias is not simply a matter of statistical correction. It also requires a critical examination of the research process. Encouraging the publication of null results, promoting pre-registration of studies, and fostering greater transparency in data sharing can help to mitigate the problem. These actions can act as checks and balances on the publication ecosystem, encouraging a more accurate and balanced reflection of the underlying economic realities. The goal is to create a system where both positive and negative findings contribute to the collective understanding, ensuring that the river of knowledge flows smoothly and without distortion. In essence, Meta-analysis, when diligently applied, serves as a vital corrective lens, helping us to refine our understanding of behavioral game theory. By acknowledging and actively addressing the potential for publication bias, we can move closer to a more accurate and nuanced appreciation of the interplay between fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality in shaping economic behavior. Understanding this balancing act keeps our economic models more realistic. But as we refine our methodologies and address these biases, a question lingers. To what extent are the very parameters of these behavioral phenomena themselves subject to change, influenced by the dynamic interplay of cultural evolution and institutional design? That, perhaps, is a journey for another evening. Good night. Improving research methods in behavioral game theory. Welcome back. Last time, we considered the emergent properties of cooperation within simple repeated games, a gentle dance between self-interest and the potential for mutual benefit. Now, let us turn our attention to the tools we use to illuminate these fascinating corners of human behavior. In this chapter, we explore methods for refining our research within behavioral game theory, focusing on fairness, reciprocity, and the ever-present shadow of bounded rationality. The journey of behavioral game theory has been one of gradual refinement, moving from purely theoretical models to empirically informed frameworks. The initial models, often championed by the classical economist, presumed a world of perfect rationality and self-interest. However, the laboratory provided a starkly different picture. Players consistently deviated from these predictions, displaying a sensitivity to fairness, a willingness to reciprocate kind gestures, and a clear inability to process information optimally. One area ripe for improvement lies in the ecological validity of our experimental designs. Traditional economic games, while elegant in their simplicity, can feel rather detached from the complexities of everyday life. The Ultimatum Game, for instance, provides valuable insights into fairness considerations, but it rarely mirrors the nuanced social dynamics of, say, a business negotiation or a political compromise. We need to move beyond the abstract and strive for greater contextual richness. Consider the addition of communication. Allowing players to communicate before, during, or after a game can dramatically alter behavior. This shift introduces layers of strategic signaling, emotional expression, and social norm enforcement that are often absent in standard experiments. The key, however, is not simply to permit communication, but to carefully analyze its content, teasing out the underlying motivations and beliefs that drive cooperation or defection. Natural language processing techniques, combined with rigorous game theoretic modeling, offer a promising avenue for dissecting these complex interactions. Another area for methodological advancement involves the incorporation of cognitive limitations. The concept of bounded rationality, as we know, acknowledges that individuals have limited information processing capabilities, time, and attention. However, many behavioral game theory models still assume a level of cognitive sophistication that is rarely observed in the real world. More sophisticated models are needed to integrate these cognitive limitations directly into our theories. Eye tracking technology offers a valuable tool in this endeavor. By tracking players' gaze patterns during decision-making, we can gain insights into their attentional focus, information search strategies, and emotional responses. This data can then be used to refine our models of bounded rationality, moving beyond simple heuristics to more nuanced representations of cognitive processes. Furthermore, we must address the challenge of heterogeneity. Individuals differ significantly in their preferences, beliefs, and cognitive abilities. Ignoring this heterogeneity can lead to misleading conclusions. Mixture models, which allow for the existence of different types of players within a population, offer a powerful way to account for this variation. Similarly, incorporating personality traits and demographic characteristics can help us to better understand the drivers of behavior in strategic interactions. The policymaker, in particular, benefits from understanding these individual differences. Policy interventions designed with a one-size-fits-all mentality are likely to be less effective than those tailored to the specific needs and preferences of the target population. By embracing methodological approaches that account for heterogeneity, we can develop more effective and equitable policies. Finally, we must consider the limitations of laboratory experiments. While laboratory settings offer a high degree of control, they may not fully capture the complexities of real-world environments. Field experiments, which involve conducting research in natural settings, offer a complementary approach. These experiments provide valuable insights into how people behave in more realistic contexts, albeit at the cost of some control. The art lies in finding the right balance between internal validity and external validity. As we conclude this chapter, consider the inherent challenge of balancing theoretical elegance with empirical realism. How do we craft models that are both mathematically tractable and psychologically plausible? This question, like a slowly flowing river, guides our continuing exploration of the economic landscape. Until next time, let us rest our minds and allow these ideas to gently settle. Future of behavioral game theory. New directions. Having explored the foundational principles of behavioral game theory and considered the myriad ways in which fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality influence strategic interaction, we now arrive at a critical juncture. We must look forward towards the uncharted territories of this evolving field and ponder the pathways that promise the most fruitful discoveries. Think of it as charting a river's course, anticipating where the currents will carry us, what new landscapes will unfold. One significant direction lies in refining our understanding of fairness. The traditional models, elegant in their simplicity, often treat fairness as a static preference, a fixed parameter in an individual's utility function. But fairness is not monolithic. It is nuanced, context-dependent, and evolves over time. Consider how perceptions of fairness shift when stakes increase, or when the identities of players are revealed. The classical economist might argue for universal principles, but observed behavior suggests otherwise. Future research will likely delve deeper into the cognitive and emotional processes that underpin fairness judgments. We need models that account for the dynamic interplay between fairness concerns, social norms, and individual beliefs. This is not simply about adding more parameters. It's about capturing the essence of human moral reasoning within a game-theoretic framework. Reciprocity, the inclination to reward kindness and punish unkindness, also presents fertile ground for exploration. While we have established that reciprocity is a powerful motivator, the precise mechanisms through which it operates remain somewhat opaque. How do individuals assess the intentions of others? How does the timing of actions influence reciprocal responses? Are there systematic differences in reciprocity across cultures or personality types? These questions demand rigorous investigation. Perhaps the answers lie in marrying behavioral game theory with insights from social neuroscience, allowing us to observe the neural correlates of reciprocal behavior. We may find that reciprocity isn't a single force, but rather a constellation of interconnected emotional and cognitive processes, each contributing to the overall pattern of cooperation and retribution. Bounded rationality, the acknowledgement that cognitive limitations constrain human decision-making, is another area ripe for further development. Existing models often incorporate bounded rationality through simplifying assumptions about information processing or computational abilities. However, these simplifications can sometimes obscure the underlying psychological realities. What if individuals are not simply boundedly rational in a generic sense, but rather exhibit specific cognitive biases or heuristics that systematically distort their strategic thinking? The policymaker, seeking to nudge behavior, needs to understand these distortions. For instance, how does framing affect risk aversion in competitive settings? How do cognitive load and time pressure influence strategic choices? Future research must move beyond broad generalizations about bounded rationality and develop more granular, psychologically realistic models of cognitive limitations. This requires a synthesis of game theory with cognitive psychology, bringing together theoretical frameworks with empirical evidence from laboratory experiments and real-world observations. Beyond these core areas, there are emerging trends that hold immense promise. The application of machine learning techniques to behavioral game theory, for example, opens up new possibilities for predicting and understanding strategic behavior in complex environments. Imagine training artificial agents to play games against human subjects, using the resulting data to infer the underlying cognitive models that drive human decision-making. Or consider the potential of agent-based modeling to simulate the dynamics of large-scale social and economic systems, incorporating realistic behavioral assumptions about fairness, reciprocity, and bounded rationality. Another exciting avenue is the integration of behavioral game theory with behavioral finance and behavioral marketing. The principles that govern strategic interaction in games can also shed light on phenomena such as asset bubbles, market crashes, and consumer behavior. By recognizing that individuals are not always rational actors, we can develop more effective strategies for regulating financial markets, designing persuasive marketing campaigns, and promoting socially desirable outcomes. The integration across disciplines becomes a balanced ecosystem of understanding. Ultimately, the future of behavioral game theory lies in its ability to provide a more accurate and nuanced understanding of human behavior in strategic settings. By embracing complexity, incorporating insights from diverse disciplines, and remaining grounded in empirical evidence, we can unlock the secrets of social interaction and design institutions that foster cooperation, efficiency, and fairness. But as we venture deeper into this intellectual landscape, we must ask, what new limitations will we discover as we push the boundaries of our understanding, and what unforeseen challenges await us in the next phase of economic thought? Chapter 43. Computational Modeling of Behavioral Strategies. Yes, we were just discussing the limitations of purely rational models in predicting economic behavior. And where do we turn when the neatly predictable falters? We venture into the rich, sometimes chaotic, yet ultimately fascinating realm of behavioral game theory. Tonight, we'll explore how we can use computational models to better understand fairness, reciprocity, and the inescapable bounds of human rationality. Think of it as building a digital mirror, reflecting not just idealized actions, but the subtle imperfections that make us, well, us. Let us begin by acknowledging the inherent challenge. The classical economist, with his perfectly rational actor, provides a clear, albeit often inaccurate, baseline. But how do we formalize something as nuanced as fairness? How do we translate the impulse to reciprocate, that fundamental give and take, into equations? The answer, as it often is, lies in abstraction and approximation. We construct models that simplify, yet retain the essence of these behavioral drivers. Consider, for instance, the Ultimatum Game. A simple scenario. One player proposes how to divide a sum of money. The other either accepts or rejects the offer. If rejected, neither player receives anything. Classical game theory predicts that even the smallest offer should be accepted, as something is always better than nothing. Yet, empirical evidence consistently shows that low offers are frequently rejected, demonstrating a preference for fairness, even at a personal cost. The feeling of being unjustly treated overrides pure self-interest. We can model this behavior by incorporating parameters that represent an individual's sensitivity to fairness. One common approach is to introduce a fairness utility component into the player's payoff function. This component penalizes the player when they receive less than a certain fraction of the total, or when they perceive the other player as receiving an unfairly large share. The strength of this penalty is determined by individual parameters, reflecting varying levels of fairness concern. Imagine a dial in their head, calibrated differently for each of us. Some are highly sensitive, others less so. Furthermore, reciprocity, the propensity to reward kindness and punish unkindness, can be modeled using similar mechanisms. In repeated games, where players interact multiple times, strategies like tit for tat have proven remarkably successful. This strategy starts with cooperation, but then mirrors the opponent's previous move. If the opponent cooperates, so does the player. If the opponent defects, the player defects in the next round, effectively punishing the defection. The long-term value of cooperation outweighs the short-term gain of betrayal. Computational models allow us to explore the dynamics of these strategies in complex environments. We can simulate populations of agents, each with different levels of fairness, sensitivity, and reciprocity, and observe how their interactions evolve over time. This allows us to identify conditions under which cooperation emerges and sustains itself, and conditions under which it breaks down. It's like observing a miniature society, governed by programmed impulses. But perhaps the most critical element, and arguably the most challenging to model, is bounded rationality. We are, after all, not perfectly rational beings. Our cognitive abilities are limited, our information is incomplete, and our decisions are often driven by heuristics and biases. Modeling this requires moving beyond the assumption of perfect optimization. One approach is to incorporate cognitive limitations into the model. For example, agents might only consider a limited number of possible strategies, or they might make decisions based on simplified representations of the game. Another approach is to use learning models, where agents gradually adjust their strategies based on their past experiences. They learn from their mistakes, slowly adapting to the environment. It is like watching them feel around in the dark, slowly developing a mental map. The policymaker, keen to nudge behavior towards desirable outcomes, finds these models invaluable. Understanding how people actually behave, rather than how they should behave according to idealized theories, allows for the design of more effective interventions. Imagine trying to steer a ship with only a theoretical understanding of currents and winds. Behavioral models provide a more accurate picture of the forces at play. Computational modeling of behavioral strategies is an ongoing endeavor. It is a field that requires constant refinement, driven by new empirical evidence and advancements in computational techniques. We build these models, test them against real-world data, refine them, and then start the process again. It's a cycle of observation, modeling, and validation. The pursuit of a more accurate, if not perfect, reflection of human economic behavior. And that brings us to the question of how to incorporate the ever-shifting landscape of social norms and cultural influences into these models. How do we account for the fact that what is considered fair varies across different societies and contexts? That is a puzzle for another evening, perhaps. A complex landscape awaits us. Chapter 44. The role of AI in game theoretic analysis. Yes. Last we spoke of the elegant, if somewhat idealized, world of classical game theory. We built our models on rational actors, each a calculating engine maximizing their own utility. A beautiful, symmetrical construct, but one that often diverges from observed human behavior. Tonight, we delve into the evolving landscape where artificial intelligence meets behavioral game theory, a space where fairness, reciprocity, and the very real constraints of bounded rationality hold sway. Classical game theory often posits a world of perfect information and unlimited processing power. Each player, like a perfectly tuned instrument, knows the rules, understands the payoffs, and can instantly compute the optimal strategy. Behavioral game theory, however, acknowledges the human element, the biases, the heuristics, the emotional responses that color our decisions. We are, after all, not perfectly rational machines. And here, in this very departure from perfect rationality, lies the opportunity for artificial intelligence to play a transformative role. Consider fairness. In the classic Ultimatum Game, one player proposes a split of a sum of money, and the other can either accept or reject. The classical economist would predict that any non-zero offer should be accepted, as something is always better than nothing. Yet, empirical evidence consistently shows that people reject offers they perceive as unfair, even if it means receiving nothing themselves. They are willing to sacrifice material gain to punish perceived injustice. Now imagine training an AI agent on vast datasets of Ultimatum Game experiments, exposing it not only to the outcomes, but also to the nuances of facial expressions, tone of voice, and contextual factors that might influence the perception of fairness. The AI, unburdened by its own emotional biases, could identify patterns and predictors of fair behavior that would be impossible for a human analyst to discern. It could then be used to predict how fairness perceptions might impact policy implementation or market dynamics. Reciprocity, the tendency to respond to kindness with kindness and to unkindness with unkindness, presents another fertile ground for AI applications. Standard game theory often struggles to account for the complexities of repeated interactions and the evolution of trust. Humans are naturally inclined to cooperate, even at a short-term cost, if they believe that others will reciprocate. An AI, equipped with reinforcement learning algorithms, could be trained to navigate complex social dilemmas, learning to optimize its behavior based on the observed reciprocity of others. This could be invaluable in designing mechanisms to promote cooperation in areas such as environmental protection or public goods provision. The policymaker could use such an AI simulation to test the likely impact of different incentives on encouraging cooperation. Furthermore, the concept of bounded rationality, the recognition that our cognitive abilities are limited, opens up a vast array of possibilities. We often rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to make decisions in complex situations. These heuristics can lead to systematic biases, but they also allow us to function effectively in a world of overwhelming information. An AI could be used to model these heuristics, exploring how they influence strategic decision-making and how they might be exploited or mitigated. Think, for instance, of the anchoring bias, where our initial exposure to a number influences subsequent judgments. An AI could simulate how this bias might affect negotiation outcomes or consumer behavior, providing valuable insights for marketing strategies or regulatory design. The marketing director could utilize this to understand how to optimally present prices and promotions. The integration of AI into behavioral game theory is not without its challenges. The datasets used to train these AI models must be carefully curated to avoid perpetuating existing biases. The models themselves must be transparent and interpretable, allowing us to understand the reasoning behind their predictions. And, perhaps most importantly, we must be mindful of the ethical implications of using AI to predict and influence human behavior. We must strive to use these tools to promote fairness, cooperation, and well-being, rather than to manipulate or exploit. Ultimately, the convergence of AI and behavioral game theory represents a powerful new frontier in our understanding of strategic interaction. It offers the potential to move beyond the idealized assumptions of classical models and to develop more realistic and nuanced accounts of human behavior. As we continue to explore this intersection, we may find ourselves asking, what new frontiers in economics will unfold as we incorporate the unpredictable element of human emotion into algorithmic analysis? And how will this interplay of the rational and the irrational reshape our understanding of economic systems? Conclusion. Towards a more human economics, we've journeyed through the intricate landscape of behavioral game theory, a realm where the idealized assumptions of perfect rationality dissolve into the complexities of human behavior. Where self-interest, once a lodestar, flickers amidst the competing signals of fairness, reciprocity, and the very real limitations of our minds. It's fitting, then, as we approach our conclusion, to consider the implications of this shift, to ask ourselves what a more human economics might entail. Throughout our exploration, we've witnessed the erosion of Homo economicus, that hypothetical being driven solely by calculated self-interest. Behavioral game theory demonstrates that individuals are not merely utility-maximizing machines. They are influenced by a tapestry of factors that defy simple quantification: a sense of justice, a desire for social approval, and an aversion to inequity. These are not mere anomalies. They are fundamental aspects of our nature, shaping our choices in profound ways. Consider the Ultimatum Game, a seemingly simple experiment that consistently reveals the power of fairness. The classical economist, adhering to the dictates of pure rationality, would advise accepting any offer, no matter how small. Yet, human subjects consistently reject offers perceived as unfair, even at a personal cost. This seemingly irrational behavior highlights the importance of procedural justice and the intrinsic value we place on equitable outcomes. It suggests that utility is not solely defined by material gain, but also by a sense of moral satisfaction. Reciprocity, another cornerstone of human interaction, further complicates the economic landscape. The notion that we are predisposed to return favors, to reward kindness, and to punish transgressions challenges the assumption of purely selfish behavior. The prisoner's dilemma, often used to illustrate the challenges of cooperation, takes on a new dimension when reciprocity is considered. Repeated interactions, coupled with the expectation of reciprocal behavior, can foster cooperation even in situations where defection would be the rational choice in a single encounter. This dynamic highlights the importance of trust and social norms in shaping economic outcomes. But perhaps the most significant contribution of behavioral game theory lies in its acknowledgement of bounded rationality. We are not omniscient beings capable of processing infinite amounts of information. Our cognitive abilities are limited. We rely on heuristics, biases, and mental shortcuts to navigate the complexities of the world. The policymaker, designing interventions to promote economic efficiency, must account for these limitations. Nudging, a technique that gently guides individuals towards better choices without restricting their freedom, represents a practical application of this understanding. By framing choices in a way that aligns with our cognitive biases, we can subtly influence behavior and achieve desired outcomes without resorting to coercive measures. The implications for policy are profound. Traditional economic models, based on the assumption of perfect rationality, often fail to predict real-world behavior. By incorporating insights from behavioral game theory, we can develop more effective policies that are better aligned with human nature. This requires a shift in perspective, a move away from the idealized abstractions of neoclassical economics towards a more nuanced and realistic understanding of how people actually make decisions. It demands empathy, an ability to see the world through the eyes of others, and a recognition that economic behavior is not solely driven by cold calculation, but also by emotions, values, and social consideration. This more human economics doesn't necessarily imply abandoning the principles of efficiency and growth. Rather, it suggests a more holistic approach, one that balances material well-being with social justice, environmental sustainability, and the promotion of human flourishing. It implies designing economic systems that are not only productive, but also fair, equitable, and conducive to human happiness. It asks us to consider the ethical dimensions of economic activity, to question the assumptions that underpin our models, and to strive for a more just and compassionate world. As we conclude this exploration, the path forward remains open. We have glimpsed the potential of a more human economics, one that acknowledges the complexities of human behavior and strives to create systems that are both efficient and equitable. Yet, many questions remain unanswered. How can we best integrate behavioral insights into policy design? How can we foster a culture of trust and reciprocity? And perhaps most importantly, how can we ensure that economic progress serves the needs of all, not just the privileged few? These are the challenges that await us as we embark on the next phase of our economic journey, a journey towards a more sustainable and humane future. What role will artificial intelligence play in exacerbating or mitigating our inherent biases?